national coronavirus response. He testified before the House Ways and Means Committee on President Trump's 2021 budget proposal and was asked about the government's response to the outbreak, as well as its economic impact.
Seats. We want to be able to take advantage of the opportunity this morning to give the Secretary time for the give and take and the dialogue that we're going to embrace here for the next couple of hours. I think we can proceed on the first issue so that we can get to the chairman. It is of no controversy. So first, let me call the Ways and Means Committee to order. Good morning. Before turning to our hearing this morning, the committee's annual budget on views and estimates for fiscal year 2021 in accordance with the requirements of Section 301D of the Congressional Budget Act of 1974 and House Rules X Clause 4F. Members will find a copy of the letter to the Budget Committee in front of them, and you've also received the same in advance of today's notice. Let me thank Ranking Member Brady for working with me on this matter so that we are able to submit a consensus document to the Budget Committee that reflects the priorities of the Ways and Means Committee as a whole. Without objection, the views and estimates will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. And if there are no amendments, I will now recognize Mr. Thompson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report the committee's annual budget views and estimates letter for 2021 to the Committee on Budget.
All those in favor of the gentleman's motion, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The question is on reporting the Budget Ways and Means Committee for fiscal year 21. Now, without objection, the staff are authorized to make technical and conforming changes, and with that, the committee markup is adjourned. Should be that easy for you, Mr. Secretary. Now, I want to call to order pursuant to notice the hearing on the proposed fiscal year 2021 budget with Secretary Stephen Mnuchin. Mr. Secretary, welcome and thank you for joining us today. We are here to examine the President's 2021 budget, a proposal that doubles down on Republican policy of expanding benefits for wealthy Americans and special interests at the expense of the middle class. The year after the Republican tax law went into effect, we saw the sharpest drop in 50 years in the amount of income taxes that corporations paid. On top of the predicted losses, the Congressional Budget Office reports that Treasury's business-friendly regulations combined with tax planners' workarounds will cause the government to miss out on an additional $110 billion in tax revenue. Here's what's clear. The tax law that was passed here in December of 2017 did very little to help middle-class Americans, and they sure at the moment have not seen the benefits they were promised. Wages are still stagnant, and evidence points to state and local minimum wage increases that have driven off the limited wage growth that we have witnessed. The President claimed that in 2017 his tax law would cause the economy to grow by as much as 6%. That growth never materialized. Instead, growth slowed to barely above 2% in the fourth quarter, as most economists recommended and suggested, roughly the same rate that we had seen before the tax cuts. The sugar high of the tax vote has worn off, and more trouble is on the horizon now, especially with the spread of coronavirus shaking world markets. In this moment of crisis, we need sound leadership and reassurance from the President. We hope that he will inspire confidence in the government's ability to address this health emergency. This is time for the careerists and the experts to be heard. And now, the decrease in the people with comprehensive health care coverage that resulted in the 2017 tax law, it was damaging to the Affordable Care Act, and it threatens to exacerbate the coronavirus crisis. This development is especially dangerous as the administration promotes junk insurance plans that lack essential health benefits, like coverage for hospital services to treat coronavirus. We meet today not just in the midst of a health crisis, but also during tax filing season. Yet again, lower-income Americans find themselves receiving worse treatment than their wealthier peers. Millions of workers had to wait, and many may still be waiting on their refunds for the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Refundable Child Tax Credit. These tax filers deserve to receive their refunds immediately after February 15th and should not face weeks of IRS delays in processing. Last year, Ways and Means Democrats sought to bring more fairness to the code and voted to expand these important tax credits as part of my legislation, the Economic Mobility Act. I'm pleased to see there is a slight increase in IRS funding in the President's budget, but the request still falls far lower than the amount the agency received a decade ago. While we need to provide the IRS with the resources required to support its important work, we must also ensure that it executes the work fairly and responsibly. Low-income tax filers should not be audited at a disproportionately higher rate simply because their returns are less complicated to examine. The IRS needs to go after tax frauds and cheats at every income level. I will note that I was pleased to see that you appointed a new national taxpayer advocate, Erin Collins. We look forward to working with her as she carries out her critical service to American taxpayers during this filing season and indeed throughout the year. Mr. Secretary, there's much work for us to do together, and I'm delighted that you're here today. And I would say that before the administration begins to entertain any proposals for temporary tax cuts, the most important way that we can proceed, in my judgment, and I think all Democrats on this committee and many Republicans feel the same way, if we're to develop a stimulus package, the soundest way to do that is clearly to proceed with a major infrastructure initiative that the President has repeatedly promised and you and I have had very meaningful conversations about. With that, let me recognize the ranking member acting, Mr. Nunez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Mr. Secretary, for joining us here today. The Democrats running for president this year are spreading horror stories about the current state of the American economy. Senator Bernie Sanders stated that the average American worker is not making a nickel more in real inflation-accounted dollars than he or she did 45 years ago. Former Vice President Biden has purported that the wealthy are the only ones doing well. And former South Bend Mayor, Mr. Buttigieg, has said that a lot of the growth isn't getting to most of us. Shy of the facts and heavy on politics, Democrats are attempting to convince the public that the economy is not working. But under the leadership of President Trump, yourself, and Republicans in Congress, we have adopted specific policies focusing on lower taxes, modernized trade, balanced regulation that has sparked historic economic growth, including real wage growth for all income brackets. These policies have put us in a much better position to face global headwinds. That's why our economy alone has grown strongly while other group of 7 countries faltered. And that's why we will be able to sustain the challenges posed by the novel coronavirus. And while the Democrats here today will say our reforms aren't working, Mr. Secretary, American workers and businesses are seeing past the defeatist rhetoric. Today, workers are enjoying one of the strongest economies in our nation's history. Republican tax reform has changed the trajectory of our economy. That is evidenced in a recent baseline report from the Congressional Budget Office, which shows the American economy is growing, creating jobs, and generating all-time highs in revenue. Economic growth has beaten expectations made by these nonpartisan scorekeepers 2 years in a row. But this is where I agree with my Democratic colleagues. We shouldn't just look at the top-line numbers, because what is happening at the microeconomic level is even more historic. Income inequality has declined in all metrics for the first time in decades, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics' current population survey. Throughout 2019, wages grew by 5.2% for low-income workers in the 90th percentile, while wages for those at the top saw a modest increase of 1.9%. This means, on average, factory workers voting today in California saw a $3,500 more in their paychecks last year. Non-supervisory workers are seeing substantially higher wage growth than their managers, and those with just a bachelor's degree are seeing faster wage growth than those with advanced degrees. Most important, the poor are gaining the most. According to the White House Council of Economic Advisors, wealth for the bottom 50% of workers is up nearly 47%, while those at the top, it is up only 13%. This wage growth points to why consumer confidence is so high today. Overall, economic confidence clocked by Americans is at a 20-year peak. Gallup found that rarely in the years that Gallup has tracked public ratings of the economy, Since the early 1990s, have Americans had higher confidence in the economy than they do now. The strength of the U.S. economy depends on the foundation of a strong working class, and under the Trump administration, workers are reaping the benefits of policies that put their needs first. Republicans and you, Mr. Secretary, continue to elevate policies that will continue this historic streak. A new North American trade pact was just signed into law. An initial trade deal between us and China, the world's second largest economy, was recently implemented, and we overhauled our nation's retirement system to make it easier for families to save for the future while equipping small businesses to offer retirement plans. This growth can continue, and while congressional Democrats brood with their obsession with ousting President Trump from office, it's good to see you are staying focused on the big things that matter most to the American people. The naysayers can continue to deny reality, but the incredible success of this economy is actually beyond dispute. The path forward is clear. We must extend and deepen the tax cuts, continue improving our trade relationship to benefit American workers, and expand even more effort to help Main Street hire, expand, and invest. Mr. Secretary, I look forward to a productive discussion today on how we can best make that happen. With that, thank you, Chairman Neal, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Nunez. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. We appreciate your presence here this morning. We have received your written testimony, and it will be part of the official record in its entirety. I ask now that you proceed by summarizing your remarks in 5 minutes. Mr. Secretary, please proceed.
Thank you very much. Chairman Neal, Acting Ranking Member Nunes, and members of the committee, I am pleased to be here with you today to discuss the President's 2021 budget and the Treasury Department's top priorities. I first want to note that the administration is closely monitoring the coronavirus and its effects on public health, as well as any effects on supply chains, markets, and the broader economy. The administration is coordinating with international organizations and counterparts in other countries. This morning I had a call with the G7 finance ministers and central bank governors to do everything possible to limit the spread of the virus and limit the harm that it causes. We stand ready to work closely with Congress on the emergency funding package and any other related issues. Turning to our broader priorities, I am pleased to report that President Trump's economic agenda is working. Tax cuts, regulatory relief, and better trade deals are improving the lives of hardworking Americans. Unemployment remains historically low at 3.6%. January's labor force participation rates among prime age adults reached 83.1%, an 11-year high. America's economic strength and competitiveness is a bright spot in the world as other nations experience headwinds. The President's 2021 budget for the Treasury Department makes clear that we continue to prioritize economic growth as well as our critical role in national security matters. Of particular interest, we are requesting $12 billion for the IRS. This includes funding to implement the Taxpayer First Act and the third year of Integrated Business Systems Modernization Plan. We continue to bring the IRS into the 21st century by updating systems, using better analytics and other technology. We also remain focused on improving customer service for taxpayers by reducing call and wait times and enhancing the IRS's online service capabilities. I'm pleased to be here with you today. Thank you very much, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Without objection, each member will be recognized for 4 minutes to question our witness today so that we may ensure that all members of the committee have an opportunity to inquire before the Secretary's schedule requires that he leave. Consistent with committee practice, I will first recognize those members present at the time of the gavel coming down in order of seniority, and let me begin by recognizing myself. Mr. Secretary, I think it's fair to say that last week that the American people received mixed messages on the coronavirus from the administration. One key economic advisor said that the coronavirus is contained, and just last Friday, the President called it a hoax. This message is in complete contrast to what the careerists and those public health official experts have said, warning the public that there is much unknown and that American daily lives may well be disrupted. In addition, a whistleblower reported that the Department of Health and Human Services may have exposed certain employees and the public to coronavirus. We are still waiting for HHS to respond to our questions about the allegation and current deployment of non-public health staff. We hope you and others on the coronavirus task force will help us get to the bottom of these allegations. Mr. Secretary, can you share as a member of the task force what the administration is doing to bring forward factual and unbiased information so that Congress and the American people can understand the potential risks and challenges? And what does the administration ask of Congress to effectively respond to this outbreak?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. As you know, I recently joined the task force. We've been meeting every day. We spent 5 hours in the Situation Room on Saturday. Let me just say I couldn't be more pleased with the work of our medical professionals across the administration. I have the utmost of confidence that we have the best medical system in the world, and we will do everything we can acting together to combat this. And I assure you it's a major priority. We look forward to the emergency funding from Congress, and if we look more issues, I'm sure there will be bipartisan support.
We hope that there will be a speedy response to the whistleblower complaint as well, Mr. Secretary.
I would just say that's not in my lane, but I would have no reason to expect otherwise. And as has been said, on the testing, we are aware that there have been no issues to those medical professionals, which obviously is our utmost priority.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, the President's Chief of Staff said on Friday that the President is considering another round of reduction in corporate tax rates after the 2017 law already cut it to 21%, lower than ever contemplated. Corporate tax cuts that primarily fund stock buybacks do not benefit the middle class or meaningfully stimulate the economy. What would stimulate the economy is a strong infrastructure topic that you and I, again, have had several meaningful conversations on. We have presented on our side a bold infrastructure package, and the committee has held 2 hearings on this topic. We've tried to work together successfully after passing USMCA in a bipartisan manner, and I hope that we can continue to work together on this package this year. We're hoping that the President's leadership in finding appropriate offsets will help us with that endeavor. Could you give us an update on the administration's thinking as it relates to infrastructure?
Mr. Chairman, thank you again. And I, too, have very much appreciated the multiple meetings and telephone calls that the 2 of us have had. We look forward to working with you and the committee on this. You know this is a priority of the President, and I appreciate your comments earlier, particularly if there's a need to stimulate the economy as a result of the coronavirus. I am sure that infrastructure is a priority for the President.
I also want to ask you today, because I've been following closely the discussion that's related to digital service taxes and your negotiations at OECD on taxation of digital economy. You know that last week I objected pretty strenuously to the French President's decision to go it alone, and I would like to get some idea of what you think that Congress might be apprised of as we go forward on this issue to make sure that these OECD proposals take into consideration American concerns about digital taxes.
Mr. Chairman, I can assure you there may be other areas where there's not bipartisan support. This is an area where there is absolute bipartisan support. We all oppose these digital service taxes. We have been working round the clock on these issues at the OECD to see if we can come up with a proposal that is acceptable to us, to Congress, and to U.S. businesses. And the President has been personally involved in conversations with President Macron and others to delay implementation and collection of these taxes.
Mr. Secretary, there are about 10 million Americans who participate in multi-employer pension plans, and about 1.3 million of them are in plans that are quickly running out of money. This has been another topic that you and I have discussed. Working people now need our help, and they need it fast. And I believe that the last man standing rule is being severely fractured even as we meet this morning. To address this crisis, last year the House passed the Butch-Lewis Act on a bipartisan basis, and the bill has been introduced in the Senate with bipartisan co-sponsors. We've talked about the urgency of the multi-employer pension plan crisis, and in addressing this pension crisis, a priority of the administration must remain. And if so, what steps are you taking to address it?
Mr. Chairman, I share your concern on this issue. I am concerned about the many people that relied upon these pensions. I'm also concerned about the PBGC. We look forward to working with the Senate Finance Committee on this issue and finding a solution that can be supported by the Senate, the House, and the administration.
And let me just point out that we have on the committee, as I noted in my opening remarks, we have proceeded with what we believe is an expansion of the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Refundable Child Tax Credit. They're very important anti-poverty programs, and we believe that we can find a path forward with the administration on these very issues. We hope that the administration's mind is not closed, and we believe that we could achieve something substantial that, on a bipartisan basis, as it relates to those two initiatives. And I hope that your mind remains open on that based on the discussions that we've had.
Yes, and let me just comment on your opening statement about the delay in those. I am not aware of any delay. I will follow up with the IRS. As you know, we have a mandatory requirement to hold it to a certain date. And my understanding is the IRS has on an expedited basis processed them, but we will look into that issue.
Thank you. Let me recognize now the ranking member acting, Mr. Nunez, for inquiry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, we can choose traditional American values that prioritize hard work, an expanding economy that provides opportunity for all, limited government with low tax rates that treats everyone fairly, instead of high rates combined with loopholes for well-connected, and freedom of families to make the decisions they think works best for them. On the other hand, there are voices on the left that believe families cannot and should not be trusted to make their own decisions about work, spending, and saving, because government bureaucrats can make better choices for them. Belittle the idea that success starts with hard work, want confiscatory tax rates at 90%, and actually believe that instead of economic growth, the government should strive for its opposite, degrowth. They think child hunger is somehow caused by allowing businesses the freedom to develop and offer for sale an unlimited number of products and services, while praising socialist regimes that are actually starving their people. The last 3 years provided just a small example of how low tax rates and sensible regulations can allow the free market to generate economic growth and opportunity for all Americans. Unemployment rates have hit historic lows at a time wages are up, especially for lower income Americans. There are actually more jobs available than Americans looking for work. And progressive economists have had to reconsider their dire predictions of secular stagnation under which our economy and future generations would be doomed to failure. Secretary Mnuchin, can you discuss the growth in our economy since the beginning of 2017 and how that growth has differed from what many were projecting before President Trump took office? And what does this say about the basic policy divide between free markets and socialism?
Thank you. I think there's no question that the President's economic policies are working. The U.S. is the bright spot of economic growth. The rest of the world growth has slowed down considerably. And I couldn't be more pleased that we have at this point a very resilient U.S. economy as we go into the experience of the coronavirus.
Mr. Secretary, I have a similar question on the digital service taxes that are targeting American companies. I think there's strong agreement here, bipartisan agreement between the Republicans and the Democrats, but I'd like to just express our concern about the direction that the French are going and give you an opportunity to talk about maybe some of the solutions you see in the coming months and perhaps how we can be helpful to you, to what you're trying to do to resolve this problem.
Well, we look forward to working with Congress. As we've said repeatedly, we don't agree with digital service taxes. We think they're discriminatory in nature. We do think that international taxes are some of the most complicated issues that there can be. And we believe that companies need certainty on international taxation. So we very much support an OECD process. There's two pillars to this process. One is Pillar 2, which is a global minimum tax, very similar to our GILTI, and that's something we do support. Pillar 1, we are working on a proposal of a safe harbor that creates certainty for U.S. companies, and we'll continue to work at the OECD.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Chairman, we look forward to...
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding the hearing. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. Just quickly on the coronavirus issue, one of the issues in my district, in my state, folks are really concerned about the problems we're having with the test kits. Why do we have these problems? Why didn't they work? And when can we expect to get an adequate number of test kits?
Well, let me just say, task force did get an update on that issue yesterday. I can assure you that the test kits, both the quality of the test kits is being monitored very carefully, and the amount. I believe we're trying to get out close to 1 million test kits. Obviously, we are ramping up our capabilities quickly, and I can assure you getting proper test kits.
Any idea as to when we'll get these?
I think very quickly. This is a top priority, and very quickly.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I believe we must govern in a fiscally responsible manner, and as such, I obviously didn't support the $2.3 trillion deficit and debt-busting Republican tax bill. I see that your budget includes proposals to extend some of the temporary cuts, mostly related to individuals, to the tune of an additional $1.4 trillion. The 2017 Act included several provisions that raise taxes on businesses, but they aren't enacted until later in the budget window. This includes spreading out cost recovery on research expenses, raising the GILTI rate, and further limiting interest deductions. As you can imagine, my staff, and I suspect yours too, has been hearing from a very vocal business community that they'd like to delay those tax increases or repeal them altogether. And yet this is critical to the quote-unquote pay for. What's the administration's position on retaining, as written under current law, these tax increases? And can you affirmatively state that these offsets will actually take effect and you will oppose adding further to the deficit by repealing these offsets?
Well, let me just say that we are contemplating Tax 2.0. We haven't in any way come out with a plan that is Tax 2.0. So yes, I can commit that as of now, our expectation is to leave everything in place.
So you have no intention of repealing or further delaying these business provisions?
Again, as of now, that is the case. Again, it may be something we'd consider down the road, but that's not on the agenda at the moment.
I don't find that particularly comforting, as you can probably imagine. So with the
okay, I was just trying to put on the necessary disclaimer that things could change.
Okay.
So.
Thank you. During his State of the Union speech, the President said, and I'll quote, "We will always protect your Medicare and we'll always protect your Social Security, always." Then 6 days later, the President released his budget that contradicts the very promises he made to protect Medicare and Social Security. His proposal includes cuts to Social Security and related supplemental security income benefits, totaling $90 billion over 10 years. On top of these steep safety net cuts, the administration's budget proposal would also slash housing and urban development by 15%. We're in a housing crisis right now. How can we possibly think slashing the budgets are going to help us with this terrible homelessness problem we have and this housing shortage that we have?
Well, let me comment on the Social Security and Medicare, which I'm much closer to, and be very clear that the President very much supports Social Security and Medicare, as you said, as he commented. I'm looking at the budget, and in every year, Social Security and Medicare go up. Matter of fact, Social Security goes from 1092 to 1906 within the budget window. So I think that what there's really built in is some savings as a result of the economy doing better and getting rid of some fraud, but in no way are we looking to cut Social Security benefits.
Let me recognize the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Certainly thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here and sharing your expertise and for your service to our country. I want to briefly touch on an issue of concern, which I am sure you're aware of, on the proposed regulations implementing Section 199A G, the grain glitch fix. A number of us on this committee wrote to you recently about the need to ensure legislative intent as Treasury finalizes regulations implementing this provision. I hope you will take the appropriate time finalizing this regulation and work with us to ensure the producer members of co-ops are not harmed by this bipartisan provision. Also on the topic of regulations, there has been a fair bit of reporting on how Treasury has actually implemented the TCJA. I was hoping you could clarify just a couple of things. How would you say Treasury decides who to meet with about proposed rules? And can you reflect a little bit on that process?
So let me first comment on the grain glitch, which I can assure you I am very focused on and very aware of.
You've probably heard of it before several times.
As recently as yesterday, I had a 1-hour meeting on this. And let me be very clear on the grain glitch, which we already had a fix to the original grain glitch, which had bipartisan support. Our job is to implement the law. Our job is not to make policy on this. We are going to go back and speak to this committee and the Senate Finance Committee to make sure we understand very clearly what the intent was here. And we're looking to Congress on to make sure this is fully implemented. Now, in your second question on who we meet with, I would say we meet with almost anybody who wants to come in. I mean, if anybody has any qualifications associated with an issue, you know, I can tell you regularly we meet with industry people, we meet with specific companies. We try to do this on a basis of people that want to have input. On many of these things, we've had over 100 meetings. And then when we make regulations, we put them out for public comment and seek comments and review them.
Very well. I appreciate that. And so obviously there's a lot of work involved in implementation and interpretation, and so I certainly appreciate that. And I'm glad you reflected earlier on many of the positive aspects of what's happening in the economy. And I don't think these happened by accident. I think that when you reflect on the workforce participation rate, it speaks volumes, certainly in addition to the unemployment rate. And we should really celebrate that. I continue to hear from employers across my district that they need more workers. And that's quite a challenge these days. And so I hope it's something that all of us can keep in mind as we continue to build on this already great economy and hopefully even more opportunity for Americans in the future. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Larson, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Mnuchin. Let us continue to hope that as we combat the coronavirus, that people with your stature continue to come forward and speak. I think, as you rightfully applauded the healthcare officials, everybody on both sides of the aisle and across the country wants to see America succeed here. In fact, is counting on America to do so. So it's my sincere hope that we can continue, and tough questions that are asked by this side shouldn't be misconstrued as being political or anti-American, but just the desire and anxiety on everybody that I know you share to get to the bottom of this and help us move forward. I want to thank you also for your comments and your continued work with Chairman Neal on so many fronts. We had a great conversation the last time you were here about working together on Social Security. I want to commend the President of the United States for his consistency in terms of what he said in the State of the Union, and more importantly, what he said during the throes of a political campaign, when he stood up to 16 other Republicans and said that Social Security was not an entitlement, it was an earned benefit. Mr. Secretary, do you believe, as the President, that Social Security is an earned benefit?
I do.
Thank you. And I think this is something that we need to work on, economists especially. You mentioned at the start of your comment that as we look, with interest rates being as low as they are, it's going to be difficult for the Fed to do something significant with respect to what's going to happen in this economy. But making sure that Social Security is solvent and, in fact, expanding something that hasn't been expanded and touched in 37 years or expanded in 50 is long overdue, with 5 million Americans receiving checks below the poverty level, with the opportunity to modestly increase by 1% the contribution, phase it in over 25 years, we can stimulate an economy, because all of that money, as you know, nobody hoards their Social Security checks. It goes right back into the economy, and the American people are willing to pay more to this. Now, here's the rub. And, you know, Republicans rightfully brag about their tax proposal. They should be proud of that in many respects. Except the other part of that is, as you heard Mr. Thompson say, when it's unpaid for and it creates an enormous debt, and that debt is perceived to then be paid for by the very people at the bottom by cuts to programs, is what really gets the American people upset, and especially people on our side of the aisle. We would like to propose to work with you and come up with a solution that will both boost the economy and pull America forward and take care of individuals who have paid for something that they expect to be there. 68% of millennials will rely on Social Security only. More than 54% of the nation does as well. Will you commit to working with us and working to get this done?
Thank you, I will. I think it's a very important bipartisan issue, and I take my role as managing trustee of the Social Security Trust Fund very seriously.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Marchant, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Mnuchin, welcome. A common objective of Congress and the administration, I believe, is to attract capital investment from every available source, including foreign investors, to improve our productivity, boost our economy, and create jobs here at home. Regrettably, the Foreign Investment on Real Property Tax Act continues to impose a discriminatory tax on foreign investment in U.S. real estate and infrastructure. No other asset class is subject to the FIRPTA burden. In its current form, all it tends to do is divert global capital to other countries and reduce jobs and growth in construction and related industries. 2 weeks ago, nearly all of the Republican members of this committee sent you a letter asking you to use your administrative authority to withdraw an old and discredited IRS notice that extended FIRPTA to previously untaxed transactions involving domestically controlled REITs. The 2007 notice promised that formal regulations would follow to implement the IRS position. That was 12 years ago, and the regulations have never came. I understand that you have your hands full. There's no doubt about that, and we appreciate the job you're doing. But this is an area where relief will generate real benefits to the capital markets and American workers. Mr. Secretary, can you make a comment on this and give us some hope that this may come to conclusion in the near future?
Well, let me just say thank you for the letter. It was a result of receiving that letter that I got briefed on this issue this week. I share your concerns. I think it makes no sense that we discriminate against foreign investors. I think that is something that we are going to look at, what capability we have on these regulations. Many people just try to structure around the FIRPTA issue, but in my mind, anything we can do legally to encourage those investments, we will do. So thank you for the letter, and we're reviewing it. It's on the top of my list.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. On another item, of great interest, a couple of years ago, you proposed and floated the idea of a 50-year Treasury bond. Has that subject came up again, and are you still considering that, or is that on the back burner?
We did a lot of work in what we call ultra-long bonds, both 50 years and 100 years. We went out to a large group of investors, global investors. We solicited feedback from our Treasury Borrowing Committee, and I was somewhat surprised by the result. The result was that there's some interest in this, but perhaps not enough that it would make sense to issue those bonds at the time. What we have decided to do to expand our borrowing capability and lengthen our duration is to issue 20-year bonds. And both from a cash and a duration, we can issue a lot more 20-year bonds that we could possibly issue 50 and 100-year. So to a certain extent, it has the same policy. And we'll continue to revisit this. So if there is market demand that's sufficient, we will again consider this. Thank you.
And one last question. in this borrowing environment, has the U.S. government altered its weighted average maturity philosophy, or are our maturities shorter or longer than they were, say, 4 years ago?
Well, although it's not our job to time interest rates, I will say we are taking advantage of what is historically incredibly low interest rates, and we have been in the process of slightly lengthening the duration as we do refinancings, and that's one of the reasons we're introducing the 20-year bond, as it's a policy capability and another way of financing the government.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Secretary, welcome. We appreciate your joining us today. I was encouraged to see the proposals to try and strengthen some of the capacity of the Internal Revenue Service, both in terms of technology and particularly in terms of actually trying to enforce our tax laws. You have a program integrity cap adjustment with a 10-year commitment for investing more money to rebuild the enforcement function. I find that encouraging. I wonder if you would be willing to explore with us a mechanism that could be outside the normal budgetary process for Congress, that would establish a funding mechanism dedicated to enforcement on an ongoing basis. You indicate that this will, the investment that you're making of the $15 million will net maybe $64 billion. Would you be willing to explore with us a mechanism that might give the IRS that sort of flexibility and stability outside the normal budget process?
I would find that very interesting, and we look forward to working with you. Thank you.
Thank you. We will follow up. You have been engaged in conversations with our chairman about infrastructure. The budget supports a 10-year, $810 billion surface transportation reauthorization, which is only $88 billion above the baseline. And the Department of Transportation's budget actually cuts investment by 12.9%. I think there's an opportunity in this climate to be able to move forward with something that might provide an actual funding mechanism. The President at times and congressional leadership have talked about an additional $1 trillion or even $2 trillion for badly needed infrastructure investment. Can you give us any sense of what mechanisms you may be willing to entertain so that we fill the gap between the budget and the proposals, which basically don't move us forward at all, and this $1 or $2 trillion aspirational goal?
Well, despite it's not in the budget, the President is very interested, as you've said, in a $1 or $2 trillion infrastructure program, and we look forward to working with this committee and the Senate to figure out how we can get that done.
Mr. Secretary, I am hopeful that at some point we can move beyond the idea of working together and thinking about it to actually be specific. At times, the President on 2 occasions talked about increasing fuel taxes. There has been broad testimony before our committee from the business community, from organized labor, from the professions across the board that pointed out that 34 states have put together bipartisan initiatives to increase transportation funding. And I would hope that we could get to the point where we could actually look at what has happened there that enabled people to come together. There is broader support for this than any other controversial issue on Capitol Hill. And I hope at some point we can move beyond that it's a good thing to talk about or aspiration and look at the specifics that have been employed in those 34 states that have figured it out and who have actually increased revenues. And I would note that the policymakers that voted for those increased revenues were reelected at a higher percentage than people who voted against it. I look forward to further progress in this area as you and our chairman proceed with your discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly, to inquire.
Thank you, Chairman, and Mr. Secretary, great to have you here. First of all, I just want to clear something up because we always go back to this same theme that somehow corporations aren't paying their fair share. There have been many times in my life, I'm a private business person myself, that I did not pay 1 penny in corporate taxes. And the reason I didn't pay 1 penny is not because I was cheating, it's just that we lost money that year. So there's kind of a go-to to all that. But there is something that does exist. Each year, this goes back to 2018, $1,560,041,757,500 are total taxes that were paid by businesses. So when we talk about businesses not paying their fair share, $1.5 trillion to me seems like a pretty healthy sum. So one of the things I wanted to ask you, I mean, we've talked about this before. You're maybe an opportunity to come to Erie, Pennsylvania and see what's going on. You know, the greatest employment in over half a century, and as many people would say, this is all part of some kind of a scheme. Some people refer to it as the 11th year of the Obama administration's great ideas, and the rest of us would rather take a look at Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and the Trump administration and say, really, a lot of this took place in 3 years. So we've had great acceleration in labor. One of the things that's taking place in Erie, Pennsylvania is opportunity zones. So if you could come and visit us and see what's going on in Erie, it's become the template for the rest of the country. Tim and Matt Wachter, John Persinger in Erie are headlining this and doing a great job. But I think Congressman Smith already talked about it, and it is the grain glitch. Whether you know it or not, Welch's grape juice and jellies and a lot of other products are produced right there in Northeast Pennsylvania. This is one of the most beautiful spots you could possibly visit. It's like going back to a 1950s or early 60s television show with maybe Leave It to Beaver, the type of neighborhoods that they have and the people that are there. They're fabulous. There's 350 workers. The Northeast plant, Northeast Pennsylvania, manages over 17 million gallons of juice and 76 refrigerated tanks. But the real concern is the language that has to be righted in that addresses the grain glitch. Mr. Kind, Mr. Smith, myself have written you a letter, and I know that you'll respond to it as quickly as possible. But I would really love the opportunity that you could come up and see what Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, what's the election of Donald Trump in 2016, and how that community and that area has really prospered, and it continues to prosper every day. And of course, down here, the perfect is always the enemy of the good, and if we can find something wrong, we'll go after it and try to bring it down. You know, Earl and I have been working together on these private and public partnerships. We think it's a wonderful way to address some of the needs we have in infrastructure, and we're going to continue to do that. So anything you can do in that direction would really be appreciated. But the tax benefits afforded to farmer-owned co-ops and their farmer patrons under Section 199 of the tax code prior to its repeal in the new bill should remain. And this is really critical, because all those dollars the taxpayers keep, their own money, by the way, they use that to reinvest. They use all that money to make their businesses stronger, to hire people, to expand on what they already have and add equipment because of what we've allowed them to do. And they appreciate that. So I just think if you can come up and I'll take you to that area and you can look at, there's over 50 miles of people growing grapes right along Lake Erie, and they can do it because of the temperature there that the lakes provide for them. So anything that you can do working on that issue would be greatly appreciated. I want to thank you for your appearance here today, and I want to thank you for the commitment that you've made, not only to this administration, but more importantly, to the United States of America and all of us. I really appreciate you walking out of the life you were in, which was much better than this one, and coming into here. And I think at times you must feel like a piñata on Cinco de Mayo. Everybody takes a swipe at you and thinks what you're doing is wrong. Thank you for what you're doing. Let's keep up the good work. Let's keep making America great again in every way, on every day. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pascrell, to inquire.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman.
Bill?
Secretary, thank you for being here today. This isn't going to be pretty, but I have great respect for you. I wrote a letter to you, and one of the members of your staff responded to that letter when I was making a comparison between the request that the chairman of this committee made under law, under Section 26 U.S. Code 6103, when he requested President's tax returns. Let me read what the law says. Upon written request from the Chairman of the Committee on Ways and Means of the House of Representatives, the Chairman of the Committee on Finance of the Senate, or the Chairman of the Joint Committee on Taxation, Secretary shall furnish such committee with any return information specified in such request. The rest of the law goes on to say that you can't make it public, and we all know that. You rest your laurels in your response on you couldn't make it public, unless the committee votes. It's called democracy. So I got a return letter, and then I understand, and we'll get into this in a minute, you also had another request from two members of the loyal opposition that you get some answers to them about Mr. Biden's son's tax returns. So I took my shot. I got my answer. In fact, the person who responded to me, I'd like to talk to him personally about this. He said that I was being intemperate. Being lectured on civility from someone who works for the president, President Trump, is like taking chivalry lessons from Jack the Ripper. It is impossible to be polite to corruption and people who break the law. So by refusing to turn over Donald Trump's business and personal tax returns to this committee, I think you're breaking the law. You have no legitimate legal rationale. We've learned recently that simultaneously you've been offering documents to the loyal opposition. When two Republican senators asked you for the private financial information of Joe Biden's family, your department practically tripped over themselves to provide it. You sent it over to them so fast. Wonder if you stuffed it in a Federal Express envelope. So you refused to turn over the president's tax returns to us, which is required by law. It says shall, doesn't say might. I'll give you the citation. Again, 26, and you're familiar with this section, I know you are. It's right on the screen. There it is, that's the law. Your stated reasons for stonewalling our request, you never cite any superseding legal basis. The only thing you suffer is smug rhetoric and staggering lies. I told you what the law is, word for word, it's right there. Tell me the specific statute that allows you to overrule 26 USC 6103 F1A at your whim. Tell me what statute. Please.
So first of all, let me just comment.
I asked a question, Mr. Secretary.
No, I'm commenting because I find it offensive that you're telling me that I'm breaking the law and staggering lies. I
asked you to tell me why you're not breaking the law. There's the law right there.
Just to be clear, there's a third branch of government, and there are courts that interpret things. This is in the courts, and the courts will deal with it. So that's your interpretation of the law. I'm relying upon legal counsel on what is our interpretation of the law. So in all due respect, I am not breaking the law. You have a different interpretation. You're not a judge, and this will be determined by a...
Neither are you.
Gentleman's time has expired. We'll proceed. We'll move to Mr. Holding, is recognized to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to clear up some misconceptions about the President's budget regarding Medicare and Medicaid. The Medicare's trust fund gains 25 years of life under this budget, and Medicaid grows year over year, putting this program on a sustainable path so it can continue to provide vital services to those who need it, especially children, the disabled, the elderly, the pregnant women. Secondly, I should note for the record that the President has produced a budget and the Democrats have not produced a budget. But moving on, Mr. Secretary, I'd like to thank you and the Treasury Department for all of your hard work involved in developing regulations to implement the international reforms included in TCJA. These changes have moved the United States towards a territorial tax system where true game changers as we continue to work to make U.S. companies that create jobs more competitive in international markets. And given the transformative nature of these reforms, the efforts of you and your team to craft final regulations implementing GILTI are particularly important. I want to thank you for your prompt response to my letter on the subject, as well as your continued consideration of congressional intent as you begin drafting these final tax regulations. It's important that we get this right for our U.S. companies competing in the global market. And looking forward, with Brexit now solidified and the UK exiting the European Union, we have an opportunity before us to move ahead with formal negotiations on a free trade agreement with the United Kingdom. And as I'm sure you know, Ambassador Lighthizer made his first official trip to London last week. I believe it was successful, and I'm sure he's going to do an excellent job leading these negotiations. But I did want to get from you your thoughts on the benefits of easing trade between our two nations. I'm sure you're aware that London is the largest capital market of all the EU countries. It's coming out of the EU. But you may be surprised to know that the second largest capital market in the EU is actually Edinburgh, which is fascinating when you think about it. And it highlights the importance of the United Kingdom as far as capital markets. So just give me the remainder of the time to give me your thoughts on the benefits of more closely aligning our markets and what impact you expect a bilateral U.S.-UK trade deal to have on our economy going forward.
I think it's clearly one of our big priorities, and I think Ambassador Lighthizer has this on the top of his list. I was in the UK last month, and I spoke to my counterparts about this, so I can assure you we look very much forward to getting a trade agreement done with the UK. I think that our two economies have many similarities, and this will be very good for both of us, particularly in this environment of issues like the coronavirus and stimulating our economies.
Yeah, I agree with you. And when you think about the United States capital markets and the UK capital markets, they're really the only capital markets in the world for entrepreneurs to be able to turn to raise capital. And if we're able to create a more seamless relationship between these two capital markets, we can pretty much dictate terms to the rest of the world because they have to come to us if they want to raise capital and grow their companies and thereby grow their economies. So I appreciate your continued attention to this. Of course, as you know, they've changed chancellor already since you were over there last, so I hope you'll make plans to return in the near future. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. The U.S. Treasury currently has roughly $26 billion in unclaimed savings bonds or matured unclaimed debt. The state of Illinois has $1 billion of this unclaimed debt. As you may know, several members of this committee have introduced legislation to provide a pathway for our Treasury to work with state treasurers to facilitate the return of this debt back to our constituents. I have two questions related to this. One, what exactly is Treasury's current policy on the release of unclaimed property to states, and why has there been such hesitation by Treasury to release these matured bonds back to the states?
Well, let me just comment. There is bipartisan support on this, and we look forward to working with you and others. We've just received funding on this. We're starting a pilot project. We've started, I believe it's the Hunt program, and we want to return the money to its rightful owners. So some of this goes back to on microfiche, and we need to be able to identify the people, but we want to return the money back to the rightful holders, and we look forward to working with you.
Thank you very much, and we look forward to that. The Trump tax law slashed the tax rate on pharmaceutical companies by 40%, giving drug corporations a huge windfall. Over a 12-year span, the average retail price of over 100 drugs on the market for the entire time rose 214%, nearly 9 times faster than inflation, which rose 25%. In 2018, retail prices for 267 popular brand name drugs rose by 5.8%, well over twice the 2.4 inflation rate. The Trump GOP tax law that took effect in 2018 slashed the corporate tax rate on domestic profits by 40%, from 35% to 21%, giving drug corporations a huge windfall. The U.S. tax rate on corporations' foreign profits plummeted to an effective rate of about 11%. As a result, 5 of America's biggest pharmaceutical corporations got an estimated total of $8.2 billion in tax cuts in 2018. Could you share how this benefited the economy?
I would just comment, I think, the President shares your concern on drug pricing. I think he was originally scheduled to meet with the pharmaceutical companies yesterday to talk about drug pricing, but it shifted to coronavirus. It's not as much in my lane, drug pricing, but I can assure you that's a big concern of the administration, and we look forward to working with you in your office on this.
Thank you very much, Secretary. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Rice, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I just wanted to kind of go over some of the accomplishments that we've seen that are the most important to my district, Mr. Secretary, since you've been in office, since the President's been in office. The unemployment rate today stands at 3.6%. Prior to 2016, the Congressional Budget Office projected the unemployment rate today would be 5%. That's 23 months below 4% and the longest in 50 years. Mr. Secretary, why do you believe that the unemployment rate today is lower than what CBO projected in 2016?
I think it's lower because the President's economic programs are working.
And which couple of those economic programs would you give the most credit?
Tax cuts, regulatory relief, and trade.
And, I just want to highlight that when I hear people say this is only for people on the top end, I represent one of the poorest counties the poorest county in South Carolina, one of the poorest in the country. It's Marion County, South Carolina, which is 57% African American. And on the date that President Trump took office, the unemployment rate in Marion County was 9.6%, and today it's 4.2%. So I want to thank you on behalf of the residents of Marion County for your economic policies and the President's economic policies. GDP has grown at 2.5% for the first years of the Trump administration. Prior to President Trump's election, CBO, this is at the last years of the Obama administration, CBO projected that GDP would only grow at 2%, so it's 0.5% higher than they projected. They were wrong. They were far too low in their expectation of economic growth. To what do you attribute their miscalculation?
Again, it would be the economic programs.
And that would be primarily tax reform and the regulatory reform, correct?
That is correct. And don't forget trade.
Yes, sir, and trade. So we've got additional growth that we didn't expect. It just magically appeared, right? At some point, if we produce enough additional GDP growth, the tax cuts pay for themselves. Is that not right, Mr. Secretary?
That is correct, and I would say we still think the tax cuts will pay for themselves.
So we're experiencing 0.5% higher GDP growth right now than CBO projected when the President Obama was still in office.
That is.
Would 0.5% additional GDP growth pay for the tax cuts?
It will.
Thank you, sir. And let me ask you this. We have undertaken this reset of trade policy to make American workers competitive in the world. I don't know of anybody on this dais that would argue that we didn't need to take China on particularly. What is the effect of the trade war with China. I guess you could call it a war, restructuring, renegotiation. What is the effect of that on GDP in the short term?
Well, first of all, I don't want to refer to it as a trade war. Matter of fact, we've had a historic Phase 1 agreement, which I think is going to add considerably to the economic success.
I agree, but in the first 2 years of this renegotiation, let's call it that, what was the effect on GDP? Was it positive or negative?
I'm happy to follow up with you. I think there's a bunch of different analysis on this, and it's difficult to model on this. But
I would suspect it was negative, and I would suspect that this Phase 1 agreement is going to go further to grow GDP, and I suspect that this 0.5% of additional growth that we did not foresee is going to is going to grow from here, and that because of President Trump's economic policies, that we will more than pay for the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act.
Thank you. I agree with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Sanchez, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Secretary. Once again, I'm rather disappointed that you've been sent here to sell us on this particular budget proposal, because countless line items in the president's budget fall woefully short in addressing the most pressing issues of Americans, whether it's a fair deal for working families, the need for robust infrastructure improvement, or basic funding for agencies to properly function. This budget misses the mark on so many levels. On the issue of working families, the Earned Income Tax Credit, or EITC, and Child Tax Credit, CTC, are refundable credits to provide support to low and moderate income working parents. It lifts millions of people, including children, out of poverty. EITC and CTC are income-based refundable credits that give working families real money in their pockets, often to cover the basic necessities for children. So does it make sense to you that refunds for families and children from the essential programs are now being used to offset student loan debt? Does that make sense to you?
Well, let me just comment. I wasn't sent here to sell you on this. I came here at the committee's request to answer questions. Okay. And
okay.
I see them
then you don't think his budget is a good budget, and you disagree with it?
I do think it's a good budget.
Well, then I would say you're here to answer questions to try to put a positive spin on his budget.
I'm here to
call me crazy, but that's why I think you're really here.
I'm here to answer your questions, and I think there are both the student loan issue is a separate issue. Part of the reason why the student loan savings is, as we expect the economy.
But should we be using? Should we take away people's child tax credit or EITC refunds because they have issue with student loan debt? I mean, taking food literally out of the mouths of children because people can't pay their student loans back, which is crippling debt in this country, second only to mortgage debt. It's surpassed credit card debt. Does that not concern you at all?
Let me just say the student loan programs do concern me. I think they need to be restructured, and we look forward to working with this committee and Congress on student lending, which...
Okay, thank you for that answer. Beyond that, the IRS studies have found that most EITC claims filed by paid preparers come from those who are not licensed. And the studies show that they have the highest rates of erroneous EITC claims, yet there's no requirement to pass a tax competency test or keep up with changes in the tax law. Would you agree with the previous national taxpayer advocate that Congress should provide IRS the authority to regulate unenrolled return preparers? Do you agree with that? Or?
I need to study this issue a little bit more, but I would say I absolutely agree that we need to make sure that tax preparers are competent. And however we do that, I do agree with your point.
Great, I appreciate that. Moving to a related issue, the IRS assigns collection accounts to private companies. Some people on this committee, myself included, believe that only the IRS should collect taxes. But the program continues, and most of the accounts assigned to private collectors are low-income taxpayers. Recently, the IRS has decided that taxpayers should give their personal checking account information to these collectors to allow them to create checks for the taxpayers, a practice, by the way, that the FTC has banned. Why should taxpayers provide private debt collectors with this information? Don't you think that that exposes the taxpayers' private financial information to fraud or theft? Does that not bother you?
I'm happy to follow up with the IRS on that issue. I'm not familiar with it, but we'll follow up.
Great. And then lastly, there are more than 400,000 taxpayers with incomes over $200,000 who owe over $20.8 billion sitting in the IRS accounts receivable. I'm just wondering, will these wealthier earners likewise be assigned to private collectors?
Again, I'm not aware of the specifics, but I'll follow up with the IRS and get back to you.
I thank you, and I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. Let me recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Mnuchin, for being here today. Yourself and the Trump administration has done a phenomenal job in promoting pro-growth policies that has helped benefit so many communities that have been forgotten by other administrations and other politicians in the past, such as rural America. And under the Tax Cut and Jobs Act that was passed, the doubling of the standard deduction, the doubling of the child tax credit, those are two items that really benefit the people in Southeast Missouri. Those are two items that, with a family of four, of doubling the standard deduction, doubling the child tax credit, if that family of four makes $55,000 or less, their share in federal taxes is zero. Is zero, Secretary. I represent a congressional district where the median household income for a family of four is right at $40,000 a year. So the Tax Cut and Jobs Act was a huge benefit for the people in Southeast Missouri. It may have not been to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle because they represent much wealthier areas, but for a family that made $40,000, your pro-growth policies with the Trump administration were phenomenal, and I want to say thank you. And the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, President Trump and the Republicans-led Congress also made other changes to the tax code that supported farmers, ranchers, in the heartland of America by creating the 199 Cap A deduction, lowering individual tax rates across the board and providing certainty for businesses. On the 199 Cap A deduction, this continues to be an important issue for Southern Missouri farmers and ranchers. Mr. Secretary, do you think you would be able to commit to working with Congress as well as stakeholders through the rulemaking process of this provision?
Yes, and I'm glad to hear the tax cuts are working in your district.
Thank you, Secretary. Now, switching gears, I want to talk a little bit about the electric vehicle tax credit. Isn't it true that originally the EV tax credit phase-out cap was 250,000 vehicles for the entire industry and has since been increased to the current level of 200,000 vehicles per manufacturer by the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, meaning that the federal government has been subsidizing electric vehicles for quite some time now?
Yes.
And of these cells, we are seeing that over 50% of them are in a single state, California. 50% of the people subsidized by electric vehicles is in one state, that's California. Realistically, does it really make sense to provide a federal tax benefit for purchasing an electric vehicle to individuals that live predominantly in one state? You think that's fair?
I do not.
Now, when looking at electric vehicle credits claimed, a September 2009 report from the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration identified that a potentially $73.8 million was erroneously claimed in EV credits between 2014 and 2018. By eliminating the electric vehicle tax credit, would you agree that we would see that waste, fraud, and abuse disappear?
Yes.
I'm pleased to see that President Trump's budget once again included a proposal to repeal the electric vehicle tax credit. I appreciate the president continuing to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse, and his approach in making sure that federal tax dollars are not subsidizing the coastal elites. I want to say thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for being here.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentlelady from Washington State, Ms. Delbene, to inquire, and we will now move to a 2-to-1 questioning ratio, beginning with Ms. Delbene.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. First of all, Mr. Secretary, my district has been hit very, very hard with coronavirus, and I want to ask for your support as we work to make sure that there are funds to backfill and continue to support all the public health efforts at the state and local level as we move forward on supplemental funding.
Absolutely, and let me express my concern to the families who have been impacted by that.
Thank you. And while I definitely agree we have to consider the economic impacts of the coronavirus, I've been concerned that the administration has been prioritizing calming the stock market over addressing the emerging health threat. Just last week, the National Economic Council Director, Larry Kudlow, a member of the coronavirus task force, stated that, quote, stocks look pretty cheap to me, and end quote, and that coronavirus has been contained, quote, pretty close to airtight. As of last night, there have been 6 deaths in my district and new reports of infections across the country. It doesn't inspire confidence when people hear that language coming from the administration. The best way to calm the markets and the public is to execute a robust, coordinated response that meets the scale of the crisis and to be open and transparent. So since you are a member of the task force as well, what steps are you prepared to take to help small businesses and workers? We have small businesses that need to close, or workers who may not be able to work, or their jobs will be impacted. Are you considering allowing small businesses to delay tax payments, to deal with lost sales? What are the things that you're considering?
Well, let me just be clear that our number one concern is the health impact on the communities and not the economic impact, as you said. I can tell you that this is an evolving situation. As I said earlier, I have great confidence in the medical professionals. As it relates to the business issues, we have a sub-task force set up within Treasury to begin to look at some of the issues that you're addressing. And as this progresses, we may come back to Congress and look for special actions as it impacts small SMEs.
Thank you. And since this is a global crisis, can you speak to any coordination between yourself and the other G20 finance ministers that what's being done to help coordinate it and potentially deal with the economic challenges, the fallout that may result?
So I had a call this morning with the G7 finance ministers and central bank governors. We chair the G7 this year, so this is right in our lane. We have our meeting for the G7 next month. I can tell you this is top of mind, and we are both coordinating with the central banks and the finance ministers around the world on this issue.
Are you considering temporary measures such as suspending tariffs on goods from China or Europe?
We're not considering that at the moment, but as this progresses, as I said, we'll look at all the options that we think are important to help, particularly SMEs and particular areas of the economy that are impacted by this.
Then lastly, in light of the coronavirus outbreak, do you think it's a mistake for the administration's budget to slash funding for global health programs? It was $9.1 billion that Congress allocated in this fiscal year, and they slashed it to $6 billion in fiscal year 21. I should note that these cuts would also cut U.S. funding to the World Health Organization by 75%. Are you going to resubmit a budget request?
Let me just say I'm not an expert on that part of the budget, but let me just say I assure you the administration will come back to Congress both with the supplemental we have now, and if we need more money to deal with the health issue, I'm sure that Congress will work with us on a bipartisan basis.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr.
Thank the gentlelady. Let me recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Chu, to inquire.
Senator Mnuchin, the National Taxpayer Advocate's 2019 annual report to Congress classifies the lack of multilingual notices as one of the top 10 most serious problems encountered by taxpayers, concluding that taxpayers with limited English proficiency frequently do not receive IRS notices in their preferred language, impairing their right to be informed and increasing the likelihood of errors. And a new GAO report from this January confirms that this is also a top priority. Out of their 8 resolutions, 3 were on this particular issue. And it said that the IRS services to limited English proficient taxpayers are very limited, difficult to access, and occasionally inaccurate. The GAO report also indicated that despite Treasury's guidance to provide meaningful access for these taxpayers, the IRS has no real process in place to even review the items for translation for consideration. And in fact, according to the Taxpayers Advocate report, even for those notices that are already translated, taxpayers have no simple way to request that they even receive their communications in that preferred language, and it would be easy for the IRS to place a simple checkbox on Form 1040 to allow taxpayers to indicate their language preference. So considering that the average American comes into contact with the IRS more than most other federal agencies, can you discuss what actions Treasury is taking to ensure that taxpayers with limited English capabilities have access to their tax information in their preferred language?
Thank you for raising the issue. I'm not familiar with that, but at my meeting with the IRS Commissioner this week, I will bring it up with him and figure out what we need to do. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Mr. Secretary, continuing on this, the 2021 congressional budget justification highlights the success of the new callback function of the IRS toll-free balance due hotline. 77% of taxpayers who called the hotline for help opted to have the IRS call them back instead of staying on hold for an extended period of time. Treasury has requested more funding from Congress for this year to continue the development of more callback functions in the coming years, with a goal of substantially increasing the IRS's callback options by 2024. So in developing these tools, the IRS does conduct surveys and interviews with taxpayers to understand what taxpayers would find most helpful. Have taxpayers with limited English proficiency been included in these surveys? And can you tell us what languages would be available under these callback services?
I will follow up and get back to you. I'm not aware of the specifics, but I can tell you I am aware of the callback function because I find it completely unacceptable that taxpayers should have to wait this long on a phone call and should be able to expect to have a convenient scheduled time to speak to an IRS representative. So we'll follow up on your specifics.
Thank you for that. And finally, Mr. Secretary, I'm concerned about the disparity in auditing that is going on with the IRS. In 2011, 30% of the taxpayers at the very top were audited. In 2018, just 7% of them were audited. But those at the very low end of the scale who have the earned income tax credit, who are by definition low and moderate income, now account for 39% of all audits. Now, the budget request asks for more auditors. I would urge that these new employees focus their audits on higher wealth individuals.
You want to answer that, Mr. Secretary?
I do. So I have specifically directed the IRS Commissioner to come up with a plan to increase the amount of funding so that we can audit more high-income earners. So that is specifically in our plan, and I share your concerns with the drop.
Thank you.
Thank the gentlelady. The gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweiker, is recognized to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to Representative Chu, my good friend from California and I, we actually have a piece of legislation that's actually working. It was more focused for Spanish language forms and access, but we'd love to have your help because maybe it could be expanded and just do that in a bipartisan fashion. So the legislation is actually already drafted. Mr. Secretary, a couple quick things, and just one oddity. There's some amazing math out there on movement of wages, the population working. You actually see that in tax revenues with FICA taxes and those things. But one of our great frustrations is we will get some of the data from Treasury, some of it from Commerce, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It comes in many different ways. If there's ever a discussion of data, so we can actually talk about the amazing math that the working poor, the movement of their wages, the value of their labor, in the last couple of years, being some of the healthiest it's been in decades and decades. There's got to be a better way we could package that so the American people can see the progress we've made for the working poor in the last couple of years.
Thank you. We're happy to work with you on that. I can tell you the IRS either has just released or is in the process of releasing updated wage information.
Yeah. Mr. Secretary, a couple quick things. And I know you are having to build the rules and mechanisms and the memos for a number of things we did in tax reform. One particular interest I have is what's called Q45. It's the carbon sequestration and capture and those things. One of your leads has sent me a letter just a couple days ago saying it's coming close, they're working on it. Any sense on Q45?
This is another one I can tell you there's enormous bipartisan interest on this. I've been briefed on the Q45. I've had several calls on it this week, and I've instructed our tax teams to speed this up. So we are doing everything we can. This has taken too long.
Look, I appreciate that because it appears on the technology side there's been some remarkable breakthroughs on the ability for this technology to work. It would be wonderful for the world, if not our own society, to be able to get those into the field. I want to show you this article from the Wall Street Journal just a couple days ago. AI comes to the tax code. Thank you for doing this. This is actually one of the discussions we've had with many of our members here, that technology ultimately is the ultimate auditor. And the ability to use algorithms and artificial intelligence to know who should be audited, where you may have failures to file and those things. Are there any things we can do policy-wise to help you adopt technology so we also get the benefit of, the benefit budget-wise and actually probably better compliance?
Well, let me just say we very much appreciate the funding that we've received on technology modernization. This is a critical area. As you said, we need to bring the IRS into the modern world so that we can, both from an audit and matching, and we also look forward to working with this committee on additional authorities for the IRS where we find there are mistakes or issues that we can authorize correctable issues.
Okay, because there is a concept that if we could actually get more adoption of the technology, we could actually re-look at that couple-month delay that was designed into the earned income tax credit, because you would actually have the data. You don't have to wait and see if it's a fraudulent return. So we could use technology and actually get people that value a couple months earlier.
That's correct. I mean, ideally, if we have the ability to match them, we should be able to release the payments earlier.
All right. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your...
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentlelady from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore, to inquire.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and how are you, Mr. Secretary? I've been listening carefully to some of the questions, and hopefully I can get through a lot of these in 4 minutes. According to CBO, we had very, very stagnant GDP last couple of quarters, 2.1%, and long-term projections at about 1.7% growth. Obviously, that has got to be a disappointment to you, despite the rosy projections that you've had with regard to the tax cut. Do you disagree with the CBO's projections?
So let me
their analysis?
Let me just comment. The last quarter was significantly impacted by Boeing's 737 MAX and the GM strike by, I think, about 50 basis points. I would say I do disagree with CBO's projections, although I want to acknowledge in the short term, because of the coronavirus, there will be some issues this year.
Okay, so we have heard many of our colleagues, and you wax on about extending the life of the Social Security program for 25 years. Congratulations on that. But do you think, this obviously includes changes that are being made in the program, $1.6 trillion in cuts to Medicaid and Medicare, cuts in disability benefits, limiting the claims for malpractice, eliminating retroactive eligibility, taking away transportation for disabled people, changing the maintenance of effort, cutting from hospitals. Wouldn't you agree that that is how you realize these quote-unquote savings in the Social Security program?
We could go through, but again, I would say they're not cuts. It's slowing the rate of growth on some of the
Okay, thank you for that. Slowing the rate is not cuts, okay. TANF, the goal of the TANF program, or welfare as you might call it, that I've always heard, was to help people lift them out of poverty. How does cutting $2 billion a year from a program that already was cut at the set at the 1994 level, taking away the Social Services Block Grant Fund, which was used for child care, eliminating that, adding money to the child care benefit, but only cutting in other places, and then eliminating the health professional opportunity grants, which might be a career path for welfare recipients. How does this contribute to helping people lift people out of poverty?
We're happy to go through all of those with you. I don't think I have enough time to respond to
Okay, well, you don't have enough time. How about responding to this? The Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska, you abruptly notified us, despite our overwhelming bipartisan vote, that you were going to change the sanctions against him. And then there were additional sanctions to be imposed by Russian oligarchs. And when can we expect those to be put in place?
Well, let me just say on the Deripaska thing, I want to thank the enormous work by the career professionals at Treasury who negotiated an extraordinary agreement. It's the most specific compliance agreement we've ever had with a Russian company. We decreased Deripaska's holdings, so I think the sanctions absolutely worked. And,
but there are more that you haven't imposed. And
again, I can't comment on future sanctions. We're always doing additional sanctions.
But we voted for you to do them. So we're not, we're telling you to do them. We just want to know when you're going to do what we told you to do.
Well, again, we're following the law that you passed. And again, we're happy to follow up.
And there's no when there.
We specifically do not comment on future sanctions coming out as a matter of policy.
Thank the gentlelady. Let me recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kildee, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Mnuchin. Over here, we're doing 2 in 1. I have 2 areas that I want to quickly address, and we may need to follow up, perhaps in writing, on some of this. I want to follow up on the questions that my colleague on the other side raised regarding the electric vehicle tax credit. As you know, the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration has a report on this subject. And I, just to be clear, a strong proponent of the electric vehicle tax credit. It's supported by American manufacturers, by environmental organizations, by consumer groups. It's supported by utilities. It would simultaneously position the United States to claim the future by not ceding electric vehicle development to China, and also do something about our emissions and health and all of the benefits. I would gladly engage in a discussion with my colleagues about the disparate geographic benefits of various tax policy. If that's a place we want to go, we can go there. But I would rather focus on what steps Treasury and the IRS may be taking to implement the 4 areas of reform and enforcement regarding the electric vehicle tax credit. As a proponent of the credit, I want to see it's properly applied. I agree that we ought to aggressively enforce, but I was concerned that I didn't see anything in the budget justification for fiscal year 2021 that points to implementation of any of those necessary reforms to make sure, like, for example, the use of the vehicle identification number on the credit, to make sure that it's being properly applied. I guess just a simple yes or no. Are steps being taken to implement the TIGTA recommendations? And if not, perhaps, or if there's a further explanation, perhaps we could engage in that in writing. But is it your understanding that any of those reforms are being implemented?
Again, I appreciate you and colleagues bringing this issue up today, and I'm going to follow up on that. I'm not aware of the specifics, but we'll get back to you because I think it's a very important point.
Thank you. I'd like to pivot to another question. It has to do with the Delphi Salaried Retirees Association. As I'm sure you are aware, Delphi retirees have been seeking justice in terms of the way they were treated in the General Motors bankruptcy. It's my view that they were severely wronged. There's a case that's been pending that the department is involved with. These Delphi salaried retirees, some of them lost 70% of their benefits. They were disproportionately harmed as a result. And I've been critical of past administrations, and I want to echo my concern about the need for Treasury to work toward an equitable resolution of this case. I know the case is pending right now and awaiting a decision at the Sixth Circuit. This is important. These people need some form of justice. They work their whole lives. They have a right to a pension that does not unfairly punish them because they happen to fall in one specific class of employees at the point in time that the GM bankruptcy was being enacted. We need to do something about this. The concern that I've had is that the federal government, Treasury specifically, has used every procedural delay and tactic which has really bled these employees further by forcing them to have to come up with resources to pursue every legal hurdle. Can you assure me that we will work to find some form of justice for these employees, tens and tens of thousands of them in Michigan and Ohio and other places that really need somebody to step up for them? We've been trying to do that, and I ask that you do the same. Can you address this issue?
Yes, I'm not sure what flexibility we have, but I will look into it and get back to you and be responsive.
I appreciate that.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Wolarski, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, Secretary Mnuchin, it's great to see you. Thank you for being here today. I just want to point out quickly here, if my friends across the aisle really cared about helping families in poverty, they'd spend more time making sure federal dollars are going to programs that actually work, not pumping more money into a broken system. And so I want to highlight one of those programs that work. And just basically, Secretary Mnuchin, thank you. The rising rate of maternal mortality across the country is a major issue that my colleagues and I have been very concerned about. But I'm so glad the Trump administration has been tackling this issue head on. One tool that can enable the testing of innovative solutions to help improve maternal and infant health is the Social Impact Partnerships to Pay for Results Act, or CIPRA. In my home state of Indiana, the State Department of Health submitted an application under CIPRA to expand home visiting services for low-income mothers in order to improve birth outcomes and further reduce maternal mortality using the nurse-family partnership, a model that has already demonstrated great success in Indiana. The President's budget highlights that CIPRA program aspires to demonstrate a new model of implementing and funding projects designed to solve entrenched societal problems. Can you tell us the timeline for the department to announce CIPRA awards, and how does that fit into the administration's larger initiative to pay for successful outcomes?
Well, thank you for highlighting the program, and we look forward to the success. I believe that we're going to be doing some awards in April of this year, and then more moving forward. So we are very much focused on this.
Another issue that's important to me is moving the needle on the affordable housing crisis. Despite the success of the low-income housing tax credit, the need for affordable housing has reached crisis levels. It's estimated that 11 million households are paying more than half of their income for rent. That's why I've been grateful to work with Representatives Del Bene, Marchand, and Beyer on strengthening this vital program. One important part of the housing tax credit is the 4% credit that works together with housing bonds to supply affordable housing. It's responsible for roughly half of the affordable housing financed with the housing credit each year. Is particularly helpful in rural areas like mine. Unfortunately, there is 15 to 20% less equity available to build these homes with the 4% credit today because the rate of the credit is tied to federal borrowing rates, which are historically low, even lower, currently at 3.2% or lower. The equity being left on the table could be the difference in providing a senior citizen or a veteran in my district with an affordable place to live. Setting a 4% floor for the credit would immediately fill critical financing gaps for development that are hanging in the balance of financial feasibility. How can we work together to take this important step to help states address this growing affordable housing challenge?
Well, let me just say, we very much are focused on affordable housing, and that's one of the reasons why I am looking forward to working with Congress on GSE reform, which is an important component of that. There's a lot of interest on a bipartisan basis, both here and in the Senate, on this 4% issue, which I've recently learned is not 4%, as you've pointed out. So we look forward to working with you on this.
I appreciate it. And can I just, Mr. Secretary, thank you for raising the profile personally on QUIP. We have over 300 sponsors. I'm working on this with Representative Panetta to address the qualified improvement property from the Tax Credits and Jobs Act. I can't thank you enough for raising the profile, and just know that we are working as quickly as we can and appreciate your partnership as well to bring this across the finish line this year.
Thank you. That's our #1 tax fix request.
I appreciate it. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The Secretary knows there is a path. Let me recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Boyle, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm actually going to depart from what I prepared last night in light of the morning's breaking news. Approximately a half hour ago, the Fed made a pretty dramatic decision before their next regularly scheduled meeting to pursue and make effective a 50 basis point cut. Now, anyone who is an investor or involved in Wall Street will look at that generally as welcome news. It obviously has a stimulative effect, especially 50 basis points. And while that might be the reaction on first blush, I have to say, I find it concerning, because this does have echoes of the 2008 Great Recession. While the Fed is understandably and appropriately independent and should remain independent from any potential attempted interference from any political actor, whether Congress or the President, I do wonder if there is data the administration might have showing that perhaps we already know that the effect on the worldwide economy is much more severe than is currently being led on. So I would urge transparency, and if there's anything that you could add to this, and also just basically your reaction on the decision of the Fed today.
Well, I very much support the Fed's decision. I think they did the right thing getting ahead of this. Obviously, there's limited data because this is something that's literally occurred over the last several weeks. Yeah. But, I would say this is no different than any other severe situation. This is going to have an impact in the short term on the economy. Now, I would say it's very different than the financial crisis, because the good news here is there will be an end in sight. So this will have an impact on the economy, but I have confidence in our health professionals that they will develop both viral medical treatments and vaccines. So this will have a time period. But I think the Fed, we had a coordinated call, as I said, with the G7 finance ministers and central bank governors. And even in the last week, I was literally last week at the G20 in Saudi Arabia. The difference in 1 week on people's reaction as what's going on is enormous. So I applaud the Fed on this move, and on a completely non-political basis, getting ahead of the issue and stimulating the economy.
Let me just, in the minute remaining, quickly switch gears to what I was going to focus for the 4 minutes, and that is the alarming report that of the 500 Fortune 500 companies, the most profitable, the biggest in our economy, 91 didn't pay taxes last year. 91. Now, this was a problem even before the 2017 Republican tax cut, but has accelerated dramatically since then. I'm interested if you agree that when hardworking taxpayers like in North and Northeast Philadelphia, who make working class and middle class wages, are paying their Social Security tax, paying their Medicare tax, paying federal income tax, state income tax, local tax, and then they see companies like Amazon and 90 others that are profitable are gaming the system, they pay zero in taxes. That is what is fueling so much of the angst that is out there and the feeling that the system is rigged against them. So could you briefly talk about the idea that apparently was floated a couple weeks ago about a minimum corporate tax rate in order to address this clear problem, and do you recognize it as a problem?
So let me first just say I can't comment on any specific company's tax situation because that would be inappropriate. So my comments are really broadly.
Generally, right.
Okay. We have a minimum tax rate, and when I say we have a minimum tax rate, we have both a guilty rate and a domestic rate. So if people aren't paying taxes, it's because they don't have taxable income. And there may be issues like automatic expensing and things like that, which merely create incentives for people to make capital purchases and shift income from one year to the next. Now, whether people are taking advantage, I fully support the IRS needs to have proper audit resources on the largest of corporations to make sure that people are not cheating the system. But again, I would just imply there are incentives that are acting appropriately.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Byer, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions as the top economic official on the coronavirus task force. The situation with coronavirus testing is a massive public health problem right now with ramifications that I believe few people realize. If we can't test people quickly and accurately for coronavirus, it's going to be impossible to stop the spread of the disease. Especially when we're now finding that the disease is silent in so many people symptomatically. There's a huge gap between where we need to be, and that gap threatens American lives. For example, the UC Davis Medical Center requested coronavirus testing for our now 15th patient, and the CDC initially declined to test, and it wasn't until Sunday that they agreed to do the test, and the results then came back last Wednesday as positive. So we're getting all kinds of conflicting information from the administration. Yesterday, the FDA Commissioner Stephen Hahn predicted that U.S. labs would be able to perform nearly 1 million coronavirus tests by the end of this week, an estimate that far exceeds what the public health labs view as realistic. Last Thursday, your colleague, Secretary Azar, told Mr. Larson that 93 labs would have testing capacity as of this past weekend or yesterday. But as of yesterday, we heard we're still only at 40 labs out of 36 states, the same number we had last Thursday. We've been told that Virginia State Lab can only perform 50 tests, but also that they should be able to perform far more than that, and we'd like to be able to expand. So 3 questions. Can you tell me what the current national capacity for testing is? Can you tell me when these 93 labs are going to be available to have the tests? And do you believe that 1 million tests by the end of this week is accurate given the current capacity?
Well, let me just say, I very much share your concern on testing, and we need to be able to test people, and we need to be able to test people in large scale. Let me again emphasize that the situation is moving rapidly, so the difference between last week and this week. I have every reason to believe, I heard the same million number when I was at the task force meeting yesterday. I have every reason to believe that. I think the task force, well, I can tell you the task force is meeting daily at this point. I believe there's another press conference today, so we are trying to have complete transparency and give people the best information we have, and I can assure you testing is on the top of the list.
Thank you. If the coronavirus spreads widely in the United States, it's going to affect an awful lot of people who stay at home and don't go to work. Tens of millions of workers are going to be presented with significant financial challenges. And the big concern is 1/4 of all workers don't have paid sick leave. And among the lowest paid quarter workers, only half have sick leave. There's a CDC report that 1 in 5 food service workers reported to work last year while they knew that they were sick. So what actions can the administration is taking to ensure that workers without paid sick leave are supported financially if they have to stay away from keeping us from getting the illness?
Well, let me just say, as it relates to the coronavirus, we're looking at all different types of options on the table to address all these issues. And as we come back with recommendations, we will work with Congress. I think you raise an issue that's something we'll have to concern. But I just want to say, because on the one hand, we are very concerned about the spread. On the other hand, I just want to emphasize what I've been told by all the health professionals, that for most people who are healthy and who are not elderly, The implication of this will be worse than the flu, but will be very survivable. But we are very focused on containment and all these issues.
And the issue of containment is relevant to all this, but let me just do some quick math. They say this is the most contagious of the pandemics. The Senator Shelby says the first in his lifetime. At a 0.5% death rate, that's still an extraordinary number of people. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Yeah, I don't want to extrapolate the numbers, but the one comment I will just make is it's too early to be able to tell what the death rate is because the denominator may be higher than we think. But again, I don't want to underestimate the impact that this is having on people who are affected by it. So I share your concerns.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. LaHood, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, before I get into my questions, my colleague and friend, Ms. Moore, was talking to you a little bit about CBO numbers, and I want to clarify and get ask you a couple questions. In 2016, prior to President Trump's election, economic growth was running at just 1.6% that year. And in that same year, CBO projected that in 2018 and in 19, growth would be at 2.2% and 1.7% respectively. However, the actual rates of growth for 18 and 19 was 2.9 and 2.3%. So after tax reform, both years beat CBO projections by a substantial amount. Is that correct? Is that your understanding? Thank you for that. I want to just switch for a second and talk about some of the numbers in our economy today. We've seen unprecedented growth after the passing of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Unemployment's at a 50-year low. Wages consistently continue to go up. We've created 7 million new jobs, many of those in manufacturing, which is important in the Midwest. Consumer confidence continues to be up. We have more people working in this country than ever before. We have a stock market that continues to do well, and we've implemented trade agreements with our 4 largest trading partners, which is important to our farmers and manufacturers. But I think one thing that gets lost in those numbers is what has happened to lower income folks and people at the bottom. We've moved over 7 million people off food stamps in the last 3 years under this economy. Beyond that, 700,000 fewer people on TANF, 400,000 fewer people on Social Security disability insurance. Can you talk about what this economy has done to lower income folks and what we continue to do to move people out of poverty?
I think as you just outlined, it's been incredibly positive. We've seen wages increasing. We've seen unemployment go down. We've seen participation, people coming back into the workforce, all as you've indicated.
And Mr. Secretary, one thing that I hear a lot in my district is the lack of qualified workforce. We don't have enough people in the workforce today. And that means truck drivers, that means mechanics and technicians and nurses. And I know the President talked about in his State of the Union address, reinvesting in technical education, reinvesting in trade schools, apprenticeships to keep this economy going. Continues to be an issue. Can you talk about what you specifically in the administration are doing to make sure that we are getting that skilled workforce for the future to keep this prosperity going?
We're working with private industry, and the administration is very focused on workforce training and making sure that we can fill all the open jobs that are out there.
And what about specific policy initiatives that we can do or think about doing to accentuate that, whether it's through tax credits, whether working with private sector, or looking at how we can work with our community college partnerships and other areas to do that?
We look forward to working with you on all of the above.
Thank you. And then lastly, I know we touched on this earlier on the DST, and you expressed your opinion on that. I know that Italy right now and Spain and the UK are looking at this. Tell us about your conversations with them. I know we talked about France, but I have concerns about what other countries are doing in terms of moving forward with DSTs.
I've had specific conversations with all of them, and we share your concerns. As I said earlier, I think that we have a commitment, if there is an OECD solution, that those will be rolled back and the OECD solution will be implemented.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Those are all my questions.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Evans, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The first part of your mission statement says that the Treasury mission is to maintain a strong economy and create economic and job opportunities by promoting the conditions that enable economic growth and stability at home and abroad. This is exactly what the CDFI fund does to create opportunity investment, job creation, and economic growth and stability. However, the reason the President's budget gives for eliminating the CDFI fund is the CDFI fund has matured, is now capable of accessing capital and other financial. Mr. Secretary, after all the good that has been seen with the CDFI fund, do you, and what would you like to say to these communities, what needs the critical guidance provided by this program?
Well, let me just say, I know there's a lot of bipartisan support from Congress, both here and at the Senate, for the CDFI funds. And if Congress wants to allocate money to that, we will appropriately administer it. And again, we acknowledge there are many benefits from these funds.
Mr. Secretary, when you came before this committee last year, you and I had a conversation about the importance of low-income housing. Yet I see that in the President's budget, housing programs overall will be cut by about $8.6 billion. This includes $5.7 billion cut to public housing operating funds. While I believe those figures need to be revisited, do you see expanding or strengthening tools like the low-income housing tax credit as a means of seeing and continue necessary investment in affordable housing?
I do, and I continue to share your concern on affordable housing, and we need a whole-of-government approach, including housing reform with the GSEs.
You may also recall, and my colleagues sort of raised the question last year, I raised about the issue about the 4%, 9% on that. Have you come to any more conclusion? I did receive a letter from you, but the letter was sort of like non-committal in terms of the reduction of that rate. I know what you said the rate actually is, but obviously if the rate is lower, that would mean more expansion of affordable housing.
I mean, I believe, and I have to check with my staff, but I think we need legislation to change it to 4%. And if that's something that Congress wants to do, we look forward to working with you.
Right. Do you, one other issue I'd like to raise, Mr. Secretary, is the issue around CDFI and the elimination of them in terms of the effect that it has on the financing of supermarkets, which is a concern because we have a lot of potential, food deserts all across the United States, and that's a concern that I raise. You have any thoughts on that? Because with the elimination of it, you know what it would mean.
I don't have a thought on the specific of that, but I'm happy to ask my team, and we'll get back to you.
Okay. I thank you, Mr. Secretary, and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schneider, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for joining us today. As others have, I want to touch very briefly on the coronavirus, picking up on something you said earlier. When asked about the test kits, you said, quote, they should be available very quickly. My question is, what specifically does that mean? Are we talking about today, tomorrow, next week, this month, next month? Very specifically, when can we expect to have the desperately needed test kits into our communities?
Let me just say I don't have any more information on this than what's been publicly said by the professionals.
In the meetings with the task force, are you talking any time frame beyond soon? Soon could be this year, next year?
Again, I can assure you this is the utmost importance, so everybody recognizes this, okay? The health professionals talked about this yesterday. I can't tell you if this means they're going to get there next.
I appreciate that.
But I can assure you that everybody is working on this issue.
I appreciate that. My request is when you have today's task force meeting, please ask them to share with our communities when they can expect to have these tests. There are too many stories of people being left without them.
We'll try to encourage them today in the press conference to give their best guess on timing.
Okay, and I think the best thing we can do for our markets, as others have said, is make sure there's a coordinated effort across the agencies, across government, so that we understand, giving confidence that everyone is working together, and the more specifics, I think, the better. Let me switch now to the IRS and funding within the IRS. Specifically, the responsibility of the IRS to ensure that our tax code is fully and fairly enforced. Doing so requires the sufficient number of people, the training, the tools to help them do their job. It requires resources. In fact, it's stated in the President's budget that for every dollar we invest in enforcement, we get $5 back from that enforcement. My concern is that the President's budget does not provide sufficient funding to be effective, meaning that the law is neither fully nor fairly enforced, and ultimately the government and law-abiding taxpayers are left holding the bag at the cost of billions of dollars. The IRS funding currently is below the level from 10 years ago. Nominally, that is, and if you add inflation, it's even more so. Though this year's budget does have a slight increase in dollar value, it calls for the elimination of 1,200 people from the IRS. The National Taxpayer Advocate in the 2020 Purple Book wrote, quote, "Largely as a result of these budget reductions, the IRS is neither providing top-quality service nor enforcing the law with fairness to all." And the budget notes that reductions in enforcement staffing in the last decade, quote, "likely reduced total enforcement revenue collected by around $70 billion, end quote. Let me repeat that, $70 billion lost. The thing is, we know that it is a good investment. We know, as the President's budget says, that for every dollar invested, we get $5 back. I'm concerned that the IRS doesn't have enough revenue agents with the expertise and tools to conduct the audits of complex returns or audits of large organizations that may be abusing the tax-exempt status. Can you share and commit to working with me to ensure that we hold these tax-exempt organizations and other organizations to make sure they're not abusing the system and are fully complying with the law?
Yes, absolutely. And I can't comment on the cuts from 10 years ago, but I can tell you every year since I've been here, we've asked for more money on enforcement, and more importantly, more money for technology on enforcement.
Yeah, that's right. It's not just, it's people, it's training, it's tools, that's critical, but we are below where we were 10 years ago. That's been a long-term process, and we're still below that, and calling for elimination of 1,200 people at a time where enforcement can bring in the necessary dollars we need for our budget to cut the deficit and make sure that the tax code is fully and fairly enforced, I think is important. With that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Dr. Winstrup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Mnuchin, for being here. And as a physician, I appreciate the challenge that the administration is under, and I wish success. Producing test kits and antivirals and vaccines is not like wanting to suddenly crank up the production of 1 million yo-yos. This is something that's very challenging, and it's a scientific process. And I wish you Godspeed on that whole process. The Fed just cut interest rates in order to guard against any harm to our economy caused by the coronavirus. So can you speak to how our economy is in a better position to withstand the coronavirus? And do you believe that raising taxes, as some have suggested, seem to support, would greatly harm our economy?
I do. Well, obviously the coronavirus is unfortunate on many levels, but I am thankful that we have the most resilient economy right now, that we had implemented plans in advance of this to stimulate the economy and make our businesses, and that's not just corporations, that's small and medium-sized businesses, have very competitive tax rates so that money can be reinvested back into the economy.
Thank you. I want to switch from that to our efforts against poverty. From 2017 to 2019, wages for the bottom 10% of wage earners increased at an annual rate of 4.9%. And it's not just wages. The bottom half of Americans are seeing their net worth grow nearly 50% since 2017. And that's a big difference for a lot of Americans. In my district, we have companies like Nehemiah Manufacturing that are bringing hard-to-hire individuals back into the workforce, second chances in life after they've been released from prison to go to work. And I believe that tax reform, pro-growth agenda is helping companies like this succeed and help spread inclusive capitalism, if you will. And more cities and towns across the country are hoping to do that. But one of the things that I think we overlook all the time, and I don't have much time, but when we look at poverty, any one of us could find ourselves in poverty someday, and you have to go here for your health care, and here for your nutrition, and here for your housing. And really, these are all the same components that are facing people in poverty. And it's a full-time job for people to try and go after this. And what's even worse, with each one of these, we have cliffs. And they're all three different. And so I see all the time, I have single moms with kids that offered a raise and a promotion, and they can't take it. They can't take it because their kids will lose their health care. This is messed up. We're punishing people for success. And, this is something I've harped on for a long time. And, we need people at the local level to be able to make decisions for what you need to get on a path forward. That's what success looks like, is getting out of poverty, not just keeping there. So, with a diabetic, for example, if you're on 25 units of insulin and you start exercising, losing weight, and your sugar drops, we don't take you off insulin, you reduce the insulin. And I really would work with the administration to find a path forward that we bring the elements of poverty together and make a smooth transition, and someone at a local level can make decisions for what you need. Because I don't see how these cliffs, the cliff effect we call it, I don't see how these cliffs help the American who's in poverty or helps increase revenues, because you limit people's production. Do you care to comment on that and maybe guide me on who we can work with in the administration to guide Congress to bring this together to really help people?
I think the issues that you're describing make a lot of sense, and I would suggest you reach out to Director Kudlow and see if he can put together some interagency folks to work on this.
I appreciate that.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Swazi, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for being here today. I have some very straightforward questions for you. Mr. Secretary, are you aware that New York State is a net donor to the federal government? They send a lot more to the federal government than they get back?
I am, and that's because there's a lot of wealthy people in New York.
Are you aware that New York is, in fact, the largest net donor in the United States of America of any state?
I knew it was close between that and California, but thank you for clarifying that.
Are you aware, Mr. Secretary, that most blue states, most Democratic states in America, are net donors to the federal government?
I've never looked at it in that comparison. Again, we have a progressive tax system.
So most, I understand,
wealthy
I understand
people
the tax
pay more
system.
money.
So most blue states, I want to assure you, are net donors to the federal government. In fact, most red states are net takers from the federal government, with the exception of Texas. Were you aware of that?
Again, I don't look at these numbers that way.
Mr. Secretary, do you think that the cap on state and local taxes at $10,000 is fair?
I do.
Do you think that it's fair that taxpayers pay taxes on taxes they've already paid to state and local governments?
I do.
Mr. Secretary, are you aware that there was a passionate debate in the United States of America when the progressive federal income tax was created that said this may not be fair to state and local governments, and we want to make sure that state and local governments are protected? That's why we created a SALT deduction. Do you aware that there was a big debate in this country when we first created the federal tax code?
Yes, and I know there's been many debates over this issue since then.
Mr. Secretary, are you aware that many people are leaving New York State and other states because of the high taxes that they pay in those states that are no longer deductible at the federal level?
I am, and I think that's quite unfortunate. I think that some of those high-tax states, including New York and California, should think about lowering their taxes.
Mr. Secretary, are you aware that many wealthy people from New York State, probably people that you may know well, are leaving New York State and going to other states to change their residency to avoid state and local taxes because they can no longer deduct them?
I am.
Mr. Secretary, when those people leave places like New York State and New York City, who pays the remaining taxes that they're no longer paying?
Well, again, I think these states, including California, should.
Well, I know that you want to take the long arm of the federal government and reach into the state and local governments and tell them what to do. But assuming that taxes are still the same, if wealthy people leave New York State and other people leave New York State to move to other low-tax states, who picks up the burden of that tax burden?
Again, I don't want to take the long arm of government.
Well, you're saying that they should change their policies, so that's up to the state and local governments to do that. But I'm just asking you, if wealthy people and other people leave these states to go to places like Florida and South Carolina, North Carolina, and Arizona, and other places, who picks up the burden for those taxes?
Obviously, the rest of the people who are there.
Right. So a lot of lower income, middle income people have to pay that burden. Or, as you suggest, they can cut the services for the local and state governments. They can cut fire, they can cut police, they can cut teachers, they can cut other costs, thereby decreasing the quality of life in those states. So, Mr. Secretary, I want you to know that the House of Representatives has passed a SALT reform bill to reinstate the SALT deduction. It's been supported by the U.S. Conference of Mayors, the National Association of Counties, the National League of Cities, and on with others, the teachers, police, and others. And the president said recently that he's open to the idea of talking about reinstating the SALT deduction. Have you discussed that with the president?
I haven't discussed it recently, but I'm happy to bring it up with him.
I would appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Panetta, to inquire.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for this opportunity, for having this hearing. Mr. Secretary, welcome. Good morning, and thank you for being here. Just to follow up on a couple of questions that were asked earlier by my colleagues, starting off with Representative Thompson from California. He asked you about the administration's proposed 15% cuts to HUD, despite a national housing and homelessness crisis that is affecting California, and as we heard from Representative Walorski, Indiana as well. Why, Mr. Secretary, why would this administration propose such deep cuts to HUD and its programs while we're experiencing such a national homelessness issue?
Well, I can assure you that the president does care about homelessness, and as I've mentioned several times, affordable housing is something we're very focused on and want to work with Congress on.
And how does the administration, and including the president, if he has such a concern, what's their actual plan to address this issue?
I can tell you on affordable housing, we believe this is a very important component of GSE reform, and that's why we want to work with Congress to have GSE reform and to make sure as part of that we can have ample affordable housing.
On that note, what do you think of the low-income housing tax credit? I know it was not increased in the 2017 budget, but don't you think it would increase the supply of affordable housing if we did that?
I think it's one of the important tools.
Okay. All right. And what are the other important tools?
I think there's a whole range of policy issues. Some of them are making sure that there are regulatory issues that we can build affordable housing. Certain of them, as I said, are GSE reforms to encourage affordable housing. So there's a whole range of different things.
Now, earlier you mentioned the 4% tax credit. What about the 9% tax credit as well for actual development? Would you be for increasing the amount of 9% tax credits?
You know, the 4% I hear about all the time because it's not 4% and it's called 4%. The 9%, I'm not as familiar with the problems associated with that.
Fair enough. Thank you. Appreciate that. And Mr. Boyle, my colleague from Pennsylvania, noted that the Federal Reserve announced the emergency rate cuts, half percentage point in response to the growing fears of the coronavirus. Obviously, this rate cut will help calm markets, and it may result in short-term stock gains. But it's clear that the Fed is very concerned about this virus and its spreading. What does it tell you? This rate cut, what does it tell you about the seriousness of this threat and how the administration should respond?
Well, what it tells me, and this was what we had on our call this morning with the G7 finance ministers and central bank governors. And again, let me just say, this is an evolving situation. I met with the same group a week ago, and it was very different. What it tells me is that all the central banks and finance ministers are very focused on what we can do together and independently to help weather the economic impact of this in the short term. And again, I think the good news is we will come out of this. We have the best medical systems in the world. We have a resilient economy, but this is going to impact a lot of people in the short term, and that's the whole of government approach.
Understood. In regards to the qualified improvement properties, I realize you said it's the one of your number one issues. Please know it's very important for not just your administration, but for my constituents as well. And I hope that, as the chairman mentioned, there is a pathway. I hope that because it's so important to you, that you're willing to at least consider going down that pathway. If not, figure out other ways to get it done.
Well, I can assure you it is my number one priority for tax fix. The chairman knows that, okay? And this is not a partisan issue. This was just a technical mistake that everybody acknowledges. So I'm encouraged to hear the chairman say there's a pathway. I look forward to his new proposal.
I yield back.
I think that the Secretary is aware of the signposts on the pathway. Thank the gentleman, and let me recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Arrington, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for your good work and your service to our country. I think you're doing a great job. I hail from West Texas, and I'm known to brag about being the capital of food, fuel, and fiber, but we're also the capital of something very important, football. And in football, we have a saying that goes like this: the eye in the sky does not lie, which means at the end of the day, you can think you're playing well, you can think you're performing on the field, but the data, the film, the statistics will tell the story. So look at the eye in the sky with respect to economic growth and the performance of this economy under the tax cuts and the regulatory relief. Lowest unemployment in 50 years. Millions of jobs created, more jobs than we have people to fill them. Historic growth in wages and more growth on the low end of income spectrum than on the high end. More growth for the worker than the supervisor in terms of wage growth. Millions have moved off of out of poverty and off of dependency on government welfare to self-sufficiency, enjoying the blessing and the dignity of a job. On average, Americans are taking home about $5,000 more thanks to tax cuts. And, oh, by the way, tax revenues are up. Now, politicians can be skewed in their perspective, distorted by politics. And so let's ask the American people, because quite frankly, Mr. Secretary, those are the folks that matter most to me and President Trump, and I'm sure to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. Let's find out what we, the people, think about this economic growth and their quality of life today in this great country. 63% of Americans approve of the job that this president's doing with respect to economic policies. 90% of Americans are satisfied. 84% of Democrats are satisfied. Over half of Democrats in this country are very satisfied. 60% of Americans say they are better off this year than they were last year, and that's a record. 75% of Americans believe they'll be better off next year than they are this year, and that's a record. Now, let's come to West Texas with me. Let's go to my backyard, and let's talk to some real Americans, hardworking, God-fearing West Texans, like Jose and Lane Valenzuela. Jose has a he has a company called Unique Solutions, and he does remodeling and landscaping, and he does handyman services. And he says that business is booming. He says that he's noticed that the jobs he's doing are not just for high-end people, but for middle-income and lower-income folks. His brother, Lane, has decided that he's going to do some more work on the side because of all this opportunity. And he's bought a truck and a cargo trailer. He said, quote, "There's no shortage of opportunity in this economy if you have the drive and willpower to work hard." Chris Seal, another job creator in Abilene, Texas, the big country, because of tax cuts, he's expanded his operation 35,000 square feet. He's added 60 new jobs. And the stories like this, Mr. Secretary, are countless. So on behalf of the hardworking people that I represent in West Texas, thank you for helping us restore America's greatness
and restore America as the land of opportunity for this people and for the next generation of Americans. God bless you, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, to inquire.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here today. Secretary Mnuchin, days ago you participated in separate bilateral meetings with the Ministers of Foreign Affairs and the Ministers of Water Resources of Egypt and Sudan. You have been part of the debate surrounding the agreement on the filling and operation of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam based on provisions proposed by the legal and technical teams of Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan, and with the technical input of the World Bank. It's my understanding that the administration contends that we have a balanced approach on this issue, taking into account the interest of the three countries at the core of the conversation. However, there has been some discrepancy in reporting on the administration's announcement. Specifically, Ethiopia's foreign ministry stated that Ethiopia does not accept the characterization that the negotiation on the guidelines and rules on the first filling and annual operation of the GERD is completed. You know, Mr. Secretary, this is sensitive conversation and a critical negotiation that can impact the overall safety and security of the region. So my question is, what are you and the administration doing to counter the narrative that not all parties are happy in this agreement and to ensure that all parties are heard in the critical GERD debate?
Well, thank you. I'm actually glad you brought that up. I've spent a lot of time on this over the last 4 months, and I think it's a very important issue to the entire region. The dam can be a very important resource to the region, creating electricity for many people that don't have electricity. But it is obviously also grave concern. There's safety concerns here. There's water concerns.
My primary question is, what are you doing to ensure that all parties feel that they are heard and that the United States is not imposing more so than having a balanced role?
Again, I'm sorry, I was just giving you a little bit of background.
I'm fully apprised of the project.
For 8 years, they've been arguing about this and made no progress. We made enormous...
So what are we doing, I'm sorry, sir, to make sure that people feel that this is a balanced approach?
We've had over 10 meetings of all three teams here. Again, we've been trying to bring the parties together. They've made enormous progress. We were incredibly disappointed that Ethiopia didn't show up at for the last meeting. And where we are now is Sudan and Egypt have said, which we agree with, that Ethiopia should not fill the dam until there's an agreement. And that's a safety issue for 700,000.
Reclaiming my time. I'm happy to follow up with you later. I think that if you balance this approach, then maybe Ethiopia can come back to the table. I'd also be remiss if I did not mention an issue that's critical for Nevada and an area where we ought to be able to find common ground. The current IRS reporting minimum threshold for reporting slot machine winnings is $1,200 for a single machine payout, and has not been adjusted for inflation or changed since the requirement was implemented in 1977. Adjusted for inflation, the threshold would be around $5,000. So, Mr. Secretary, my question is, has the Treasury Department considered changing the slot machine winnings threshold?
I'm not aware of it, but you bring up an interesting point, and I commit we'll follow up and get back to you.
I appreciate your willingness to work with us. And the final point I would just raise, Mr. Chairman, to the Secretary is we'd love to work with you. I heard my colleague, Mr. LaHood, talk about the need to invest in skills, training, and workforce, particularly around the infrastructure bill. I have several proposals that we would like to get your support, along with the Chairman, to advance in the infrastructure package. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, and I want to congratulate the gentleman on raising a new dimension about tax policy. Thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Kine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thanks for your availability to us here today. You've heard from a couple of my other colleagues previously about the so-called grain glitch. Earlier, I and many many bipartisan members of Congress sent you a letter dated February 14th asking you to work with the committee so we can implement the 199A rule based on the congressional intent and fix this problem once and for all. Can we get your assurance here today that you're willing to work with us to find a landing zone for all this?
There's nothing I'd rather fix than these regulations. So I look forward to working with the chairman and Kevin Brady and the Senate Finance Committee to resolve this.
Great, thank you for that. And Mr. Chairman, I'd ask with unanimous consent to include in the record the bipartisan letter we submitted to the Secretary dated February 14th, 2020.
So ordered.
Along with letters supporting this recommendation from the National Co-op Network and the American Farm Bureau.
So ordered.
Mr. Secretary, I was one of the co-authors, along with Mr. Teaberry, on opportunity zones in the House, and we worked obviously with Senators Cook, Senators Scott and Booker on the Senate side to get it passed initially. But there were key provisions that passed the tax reform bill that was left out. And so we have, Mr. Kelly and I, along with others on the committee, introduced bipartisan legislation called the Opportunity Zone Accountability and Transparency Act to enhance the accountability, the transparency, the reporting requirements to make sure the opportunity zones are being implemented the right way according to congressional intent. We certainly ask yours and the administration's support for this follow-up legislation right now and to work with us to make sure the opportunity zones, which I think holds a lot of promise, out there, including in my large rural district, that's being done the right way, according to the congressional intent, and also helping us pass this follow-up legislation.
Thank you. We'd be happy to work with you on that. And in the interim, whatever ideas you have on reporting that we can implement, we'll consider.
Great. Senator Scott has introduced companion legislation on the Senate and trying to move forward in a bipartisan fashion. And finally, Mr. Secretary, there are some warning clouds clearly on the economic horizon here. And one of the key data points that I've been keeping a close eye on is whether or not this economy of ours is debt-fueled. And the reason I say that is that in the last 2 years, corporate debt has gone up by $1.5 trillion, just in the last 2 years alone. Household debt's gone up by roughly $1.5 trillion. Consumer credit card debt has gone up by $130 billion, from roughly $700 to $830 billion in just the last 2 years. Student loan debt has gone up almost $3 trillion, from $1 to $1.3 trillion right now. And of course, our annual budget deficits are exceeding $1 trillion on an annual basis with no end in sight. Are you concerned, as I am, that if things do turn south, whether it's coronavirus or some other reason, and let's face it, the economic data wasn't particularly strong domestically and globally when it came to growth, even before the coronavirus broke out, that these fundamentals may appear a little bit weak to withstand a significant economic downturn, which may be upon us?
Well, let me just comment, and as our budget does, I think that the deficits over time need to be dealt with, that fundamentally we have to grow revenues faster than we grow expenses. In regards to corporate debt and other things, I share your concern on student debt, student lending. The other areas I'm not as concerned about. I think we have a lot of liquidity in the system.
Well, and obviously it was announced today that the Fed reduced interest rates by 5 basis points. The market's still going down significantly. I'm doubtful whether that type of monetary effort can really deal with a global pandemic because of the factors underlying it. But are you anticipating any global central bank coordination when it comes to addressing the coronavirus spread throughout the global economy, or are we on our own?
You may not have been here when I commented earlier. I did have a call this morning with the G7 finance ministers and central bank governors, and we are very much focused on coordinated action where we can do that and appropriate responses.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Estes, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Mnuchin, for being here. We appreciate your involvement, all your active role, and the actually the amount of questions we've peppered you with, been a wide variety of subjects this morning. Before I make my comments, I wanted to correct a couple things that were said earlier. And one of the comments was that drug companies are taking their reduced taxes from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and benefiting from that. Actually, what is happening is that over the next several years, they're going to invest $27 billion into new cures and new capital expenses. And so that's one of those things that's a positive thing out of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. The second thing I wanted to at least note that, there were some claims made that profitable companies are not paying taxes. And actually, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act makes it more difficult for big companies to avoid taxes. Because of BEAT,
and guilty and changes into the NOL rule. Also, companies that end up may not have profits in a particular year. The data disregards that the book tax differences such as expensing or tax incentives like green energy credits or the LIHTC that is supported by Democrats and some Republicans. I encourage all members who are confused about these differences to read the Joint Committee's document prepared for our hearing on the corporate income tax, which addresses some of these issues. Mr. Secretary, I do want to commend you for your work helping guide the American economy. We've had some record and some phenomenal things over the last few years in terms of looking at our low unemployment, the economic growth we've had, and the fact that now we have more open jobs than we do job seekers, and that's a huge plus for first time in America. All that's kind of laying a great foundation for our economy to keep growing. Also want to mention, as we mentioned previously, thank you for your work on the digital service tax. Some of that, obviously, there's some efforts there coming in from other countries. It's disappointing that, starting with France, but also other countries like Spain and the UK have copycatted the French DST when the administration here in the U.S. has been clear that we need to act against countries that have those unfair taxes. We want to make sure we support the U.S. trade representatives as they work to resolve the issues with the French tax that's unreasonable, discriminatory, and burdens U.S. commerce. I can assure you that there's bipartisan and bicameral support for an OECD solution, and I just want you to know that we've got your back in the work that you're doing there. I did want to ask one question around that, is that, do you think it's wise for the UK to look at implementing a DST while they're in the middle of this trade discussions with us?
Well, we've had discussions with the UK. The good news is their tax does not get collected till next year, so they in essence are in the same place as the French.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And before I run out of time, I also want to mention one other thing that I've been working on, actually, before I came to Congress, and was mentioned earlier by Representative Davis about the unclaimed savings bond and the issues there. And as Kansas State Treasurer, it was important to me to help return money back to American citizens, to Kansans in particular. And so I actually pursued some legal options to help make sure that process happened. So I've been pretty proud to work with Representative Davis and help introduce the Unclaimed Savings Bond Act that will help ensure the collaboration between the Treasury Secretary. I recognize some of the complexities of converting microfiche data over, and I'm glad we've got some funding to help you do that. So I look forward to getting that resolved. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Let me recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Higgins, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary, thank you very much for being here. You have advocated for a 20-year Treasury note. My understanding is bond sales could start as early as May of this year. And the government is trying to do a couple of things: lock in low rates and find more options to help fund itself, in addition to new potential spending. It seems to me that you are an advocate for infrastructure spending. The President has indicated that. Our chairman has been very bullish on the idea of infrastructure spending, not only for the bricks and mortar, the improvements to the efficiency of the operation of the economy, but the growth that could come with that. Do you see a scenario where the 20-year Treasury note could assist in financing a major infrastructure bill?
Well, let me reiterate, we look forward to working with the chairman and the committee on infrastructure. At the end of the day, cash is fungible, so we're issuing 20 years because we think it's the right thing to do for the government, as you've outlined, both to expand our borrowing capability and to lengthen our duration. But that's independent of infrastructure, but we do want to do infrastructure.
Got it. And what is the average yield right now relative to Treasury notes?
I'm sorry, the average yield of what?
What could you, what would be the interest that the government would pay for issuing debt over the 20-year period, locking in today?
I don't want to speculate on something that could be market sensitive. So we have 10-year bonds and we have 30-year bonds, and the market will determine where in between those the 20-year will trade. But it's incredibly low interest rates, as you know. We're at historically low interest rates at the moment.
And given that fact, doesn't it make most sense to look at financing infrastructure in that way, which will likely increase economic demand and growth that could put us in a position where we're outdistancing the interest that we're paying to issue debt to finance these?
I'm agreeing with you completely that in a low interest rate environment, infrastructure is something that's very important to look at.
Okay. Just a final thought on this. Before the United States invaded and occupied Iraq, the United States economy was nearly 9 times the size of China's. Today, by many measures, the Chinese economy has caught up with the United States. And we have wasted, certainly predating this administration, but we have wasted trillions of dollars in wars that, you know, Iran owns Iraq today. We're doing a peace deal with the Taliban, who we took out because it's a terrorist organization. You'll never have peace in Afghanistan so long as the Taliban is not, you know, giving up its commitment to the physical force tradition. But what China did during that period, our growth over that 20-year period was about 2.5%. China's growth was about 7 to 8% annually. And that's why they're catching up with us, obviously. In China, you know, they cheat. They don't care about their workers or their environment. But what they have done, investing in infrastructure into Asia, into Europe, into Africa, is they've invested in the growth of their own economy. And that's why it's growing. And I would just hope that you and the President and the Ways and Means Committee can find a way to work together toward the goal of making a major investment in infrastructure, understanding that good economic growth would come with that as well. I yield back.
Thanks. The only comment I would just say is that China is not catching up to us, that our GDP per person is multiples, 6 times theirs.
I'm just talking about
our absolute GDP is significantly higher. But
I'm just talking about the size of the economy. But thank you, sir.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentlelady from Alabama, Ms. Sewell, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, welcome. One of the top priorities in Congress for me has been expanding economic opportunity for the folks back home in my district. The median household income in my district is just above $37,000. And we've had and face persistent poverty areas for more than several decades now. These challenges demand a comprehensive approach to economic revitalization, and we need to use every tool in our toolkit to help bring about better resources and more opportunities for these persistent poverty areas. This includes leveraging the tax code to incentivize the types of investments that can uplift these communities. We've seen the success of programs like the New Market Tax Credit. For example, the success of that program, we recently increased the allocation by 1.5 billion recently, but we've seen overall in Alabama a $1.4 billion success story over the time that we've had new market tax credits. However, I'm concerned that the allocation that the President's budget requests for this program and other important CDFI funding sources are too low. And I encourage the Treasury Department to work with Congress to appropriately fund these very important community development investment tools. Like my colleague Ron Kine, I too am encouraged by opportunity zones and want to see their success, especially since it's meant for to be successful in communities that have had consistently been underrepresented. I am concerned, however, about the lack of appropriate reporting requirements. Too often we see, especially in the news, opportunity zones seem to be going to high-end real estate areas. But I can tell you that in a rural part of my district, actually my hometown of Selma, Alabama. There's an opportunity zone that's helping to renovate an old hotel called the St. James Hotel. What I'm concerned about and my constituents are concerned about is that in renovating it and making it that downtown area be revitalized, that we don't gentrify it and we don't push folks out of that area. And so I think that it's really important, as Representative Kine said, that we have appropriate reporting requirements that really get at the social economic impact of opportunity zones. So I was encouraged by your response to him. I'm on that bill that Ron and Congressman Kelly and I, all of us are very much encouraged by this, and I know that Senator Scott has the same bill on the other side. But in the meantime, I think it's really important that Treasury hone up its reporting requirements and its transparency with respect to opportunity zones. If it's going to be a tool in the toolkit, I want to see it be successful, but I also want to make sure that we have the appropriate matrix. Do we get, it sounds like we have your commitment that we can work on that.
With you. Yes,
absolutely. Thank you, sir. Likewise, I think that working on infrastructure, which we kind of touched on before, one of the tools in the toolkit, I was a former bond lawyer, and one of the things that I saw in the 2017 tax cut was that advanced refundings went away. And that has been a major source of allowing medium-sized and smaller communities be able to take the benefits of this economy and be able to refinance some of these bond holdings. So I just wanted to just reiterate to you that there are other tools in the toolkit that we can work on that would really help rural and medium-sized communities get back on their feet. I would love to have your commitment as we work on Build America bonds and other types of ways to finance infrastructure, if we could also look at advanced refundings.
We look forward to working with you on that, and we'll follow up.
Thank you, sir, and I look forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman, on all of these issues.
Thank the gentlelady. Let me thank Secretary Mnuchin for joining us this morning, and please be advised that members have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. And with that, the Ways and Means Committee stands adjourned.